Section 1. The World Before the World. Close your eyes, or let them drift half open. Let the tension in your shoulders go. We are going somewhere very old tonight. Somewhere that existed long before the snow fell on those mountain peaks, before the first stone of any ruin was laid, before even the idea of a dragon cut through the sky with its shadow. We are going back to the very beginning of a universe, to the moment before Nirn existed, when there was nothing but raw possibility and a handful of beings who had not yet decided what they wanted to become. The Elder Scrolls calls this the time of the Aedra and the Daedra, two categories of ancient divine beings whose names are drawn from Old Elvish roots. Aedra roughly translates to our ancestors, Daedra to not our ancestors. That distinction matters enormously in the theology of Tamriel, because the difference between the two kinds of divine beings is not simply one of good versus evil, or light versus dark. It is a difference of sacrifice and what it costs to be part of something. Long before Nirn, the planet on which Tamriel, Skyrim, and all the provinces we know exist, there was Aetherius, the immortal plane, a realm of pure magic, pure energy, pure existence without limit or form. The beings who lived there were called the Et Ada, the original spirits. They were not gods in any sense we recognize. They were more like ideas given awareness, pure concepts that could think. The Et Ada had vast power and vast freedom, and for a time, that was enough. Then Lorkhan arrived. Or perhaps Lorkhan was always there. Or perhaps Lorkhan emerged from the restlessness that sometimes comes with having everything and still feeling that something is missing. Lorkhan, called by many names across Tamriel, Shazar, Shor, Sep, the missing god, carried an idea. He wanted to create something new, something constrained. A mortal world, threaded together from the divine substance of the Et Ada themselves. He gathered a number of them around this vision, persuading them that building this world would be an act of pure creation, an expression of their power and their artistry. What he did not fully explain, or what some of them did not fully understand, was that creating Nirn would require them to give up parts of themselves permanently. Their divine substance would be woven into the bones of the world, into its laws of nature, into the very ground beneath mortal feet and the air mortals breathe. The Et Ada who agreed, who chose to invest themselves in the creation of the mortal plane, became the Aedra. They became diminished by that investment, slower, less free, more tied to the rhythms of the world they had helped build. Among them were beings we would come to recognize as the 8 divines, Akatosh, the dragon god of time, Kynareth, who breathed air into the world, Zenithar, god of work and commerce, Mara, goddess of love, and the others. They each surrendered a portion of their pure divinity to make Nirn real. They became, in their way, the laws of reality itself. The Elder Scrolls scholars call these laws the Earth Bones, the fundamental principles governing how physics, time, life, and death function in the mortal world. Every time an apple falls from a tree in Skyrim, every time water flows downhill, every time the sun rises over the Jural Mountains, those are the Aedra still working, quietly, embedded in the fabric of everything. But not all the Et Ada agreed to Lorkhan's plan. Some sensed the trap or understood the cost too clearly, and they refused. They withdrew into their own planes of existence, their own private realms carved out of the space between Aetherius and Nirn. These became the Daedric princes, beings of enormous power who had not diluted themselves through creation, who had not sacrificed their freedom for the world's existence. They endure in their pristine, terrible, untouched power outside of time, outside of mortality, outside of the consequences that bind everything else. And this is the first hidden truth that underlies all of Skyrim's lore. The world itself was built at enormous cost. The gods who made it are diminished because of it. The prayer a Nord warrior sends up to Talos or Kynareth is reaching not towards some perfect, all-powerful entity on a golden throne, but towards something that gave up its own completeness to make the ground you're standing on solid. Now, Lorkhan himself has a complicated end. After Nirn was created, the Aedra who had gone along with him began to understand the full weight of what they had sacrificed. Some accounts say they were furious. Some say they were simply grief-stricken. The mythology is inconsistent, partly because different cultures tell it differently. and partly because the events were so ancient that only fragments survive. What most accounts agree on is that Lorcan was punished. His divine heart, his very essence, was torn from his body and hurled across the world, landing eventually in the continent of Morrowind, where it buried itself beneath the earth and became the source of the Red Mountain's power, the Red Mountain. The same volcano whose eruption thousands of years later would devastate Morrowind, scatter the Dunmer people, and push 2 centuries of Dark Elf refugees into the city of Windhelm. The heart of a dead god is still beating beneath a volcano. That is the kind of fact that sounds fantastical until you realize how deeply it threads through everything. Because that heart, the heart of Lorcan, is also what the Dwemer found thousands of years later and tried to harness. It is the same object that caused the entire Dwemer race to vanish in an instant. It is the same object around which Kagranak, the master engineer, built his grand ambition. We will get there, but first, keep breathing. The stars overhead in Skyrim's night sky are not stars in any astronomical sense. Nordic cosmology understands them as holes, tiny perforations in the fabric of Mundus, the mortal plane where the original Et Ada tore through reality when they realized what creation was costing them. They fled back to Aetherius through those tears, and the light that bleeds through is the raw magical energy of the immortal plane seeping into the mortal world. Every night you look up at a clear sky in Skyrim, what you are seeing is the exit wounds of gods running away from their own project. The sun is the largest hole, the place where Magnus, the god of magic and the architect of Nirn's magical systems, tore the biggest opening and fled first. The light of the sun is not just warmth and radiation, it is Aetherius pouring through a wound in reality, and that light carries with it the divine aversion to undeath that makes vampires burn. Not because sunlight itself is harmful, but because the light of the sun is suffused with the residual divinity of beings who invested themselves in life, in the natural order, in the world that was meant to exist. Magicka, the energy that flows through every spell a mage casts in Skyrim, that powers the Thuum of the Greybeards, that enchants every rune and ward comes from Aetherius through those stellar perforations. Every time a court wizard in Whiterun casts a flame spell, they are reaching up through a hole in the sky and pulling divine energy down into the mortal world. Magic is not a trick. It is not a technology. It is the mortal world's ongoing connection to the divine realm it was torn away from. There is a philosophical dimension to this that is worth sitting with. The mortal world was created, essentially, as an act of theft. Lorcan gathered the Atada under something that looked like shared purpose, but the cost was hidden from many of them until it was already paid. The world we are exploring has been, from its very beginning, marked by a fundamental injustice at its foundation. The gods who made it are smaller for having made it. The beings who refuse to make it have more power than the beings who gave everything. And somewhere, beneath a volcano in Morrowind, the heart of the being who orchestrated all of this still pulses. This shapes everything about how the civilizations of Tamriel understand reality. The Nords believe time is cyclical, that the world will end and be reborn in a process the Aedra anticipated and accepted. The Dwemer believed the divine was simply a problem to be solved through engineering. The Altmer, the High Elves, who formed the backbone of the Aldmeri Dominion in Skyrim's era, believed that creating Nirn was a catastrophe, and that the correct goal is to undo it, to return all mortal souls to their original divine form by dissolving the barrier between Mundus and Aetherius. Their entire political project in Skyrim's era, banning Talos worship, keeping the Empire weak, using the Civil War as a drain on human military capacity, is in service of a cosmological goal that most humans never perceive. The Thalmor are not simply religious zealots enforcing petty doctrine. They are the ideological descendants of a cosmological conviction that the mortal world was a mistake and that unmistaking it requires weakening every force that keeps it stable. Talos, in this view, is not merely an offense to elvish religious sensibilities. Talos represents the most dangerous possible refutation of Altmeri cosmology, the argument made flesh that a mortal being can become divine, that the direction of travel is not from divine back to divine through dissolution, but from mortal upward through genuine achievement. If Talos could ascend, then the barrier between the mortal and the divine is permeable in both directions. That possibility undermines the entire philosophical structure on which Altmeri identity has been built for thousands of years. Understanding that changes everything about how the Civil War reads. It is not simply about taxation or cultural identity or Nordic independence from imperial governance. It is about the long game being played by beings who have the patience of immortals, who think in centuries the way humans think in years, who are willing to let humans kill each other in a civil war for decades, because dead soldiers are resources the Empire cannot use against them in the conflict they are actually preparing for. The Thalmor documents found in their embassy, accessible during the main quest line, state this strategy with a frankness that is almost startling. They do not want either side to win the civil war. They want the conflict to continue indefinitely, bleeding both the Stormcloaks and the Empire without decisive resolution. Every battle that Ulfric's forces fight against Imperial legions is a battle that neither side can fight against the Aldmeri Dominion. Every year the civil war continues is another year the Empire's treasury empties, and its military grows exhausted. Ulfric's Stormcloak, the charismatic, passionate, genuinely convicted leader of the independence movement, is classified in Thalmor documents as an unwitting asset. During his capture in the Great War, Thalmor interrogators extracted information from him. He has, since then, been subtly guided without his knowledge, his authentic nationalist passion harnessed to serve an agenda he believes he is opposing with everything he has. The tragedy of Ulfric is that his conviction is real, his love of Skyrim is real, his grief over the Talos ban is real, his sense that the Empire has abandoned the Nords is real. And every bit of that genuine feeling makes him the perfect tool for a manipulation so thorough that it functions precisely because of his authenticity rather than despite it. If he knew, it would break him. The manipulation depends on him not knowing. And the Daedric princes sit in their private planes, watching all of this unfold, deathless and unchanged, and utterly unconstrained by any of it. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of that settle. The game you've played 100 hours in is built on a cosmology this deep. The dragon burial mounds and the ancient Nordic ruins and the Dwemer towers and the Daedric shrines are all expressions of different answers to the same question. What does it mean to exist in a world that was made at such cost? And what do you do about it? The Thu'um the dragon shouts that the player character uses throughout the game are not simply a combat ability. They are, in the game's theology, a form of direct participation in the creation language of reality itself. When a dragon speaks, they are not describing the world. They are writing it. Every word in the dragon tongue is an act of creation, a piece of the original language in which Nirn itself was constructed. The Greybeards understand this. It is why they maintain silence. It is why learning to speak in that language takes decades of meditation and discipline. You are not learning a skill. You are learning to carry a piece of the world's source code in your throat, and if you are careless with it, the world will change in ways you did not intend. We will come back to the Thu'um. But for now, let the silence have this moment. You are lying in a quiet place, in the real world, where the cosmology is less complicated, and the dragons are safely fictional. The fire is low, the world outside is dark, and somewhere in Skyrim, the wind is moving through the peaks above High Hrothgar, cold and clean and indifferent, the way ancient things always are. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment below and tell me what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're in. I love knowing who's out there in the dark. And if this helps you drift off, or just find a few quiet minutes, subscribing keeps this going. Section 2. The Dragon Cult and the Age of Tyranny. When the Atmorans first sailed south from Atmora, the frozen continent sitting north of Skyrim across the Sea of Ghosts, they brought their religion with them, the way any people carries its deepest beliefs into a new land. Packed carefully between everything else, harder to leave behind than tools or food. That religion centered on animal totems. The hawk, the wolf, the snake, the moth, the owl, the whale, the bear, the fox, each representing something essential about how the Atmorans understood the world, and above all others, dominating the entire pantheon with a magnificence no other totem could approach, stood the dragon. The reason was straightforward. In a world where dragons were real, these were living creatures of extraordinary power, creatures who could reshape reality simply by opening their mouths and speaking. They could breathe fire that consumed stone, They could shout and knock armies from their feet. They flew above the clouds, and their shadows fell across entire valleys when they descended. In a world like that, in a time before organized armies and fortified cities, the gap between a dragon and a human was not merely physical, it was metaphysical. Dragons spoke the language of creation itself. Humans could only listen. So when the Atmoran settlers arrived in what would become Skyrim and found dragons already there, circling the mountain peaks, roosting on the high ridges, watching the newcomers with ancient intelligence, it was natural, almost inevitable, that the relationship would be one of reverence. The Atmorans did not worship dragons because they were tricked. They worshipped them because dragons were, by any practical measure available at the time, worth worshipping. The dragon cult began not as an instrument of oppression, but as something much more nuanced. In its earliest form, in Atmora and in the first generations of Skyrim settlement, dragon priests served as intermediaries. They were the learned, the dedicated, the spiritually adept individuals who had cultivated enough knowledge and discipline to communicate meaningfully with the dragons, to understand their language, to carry messages between the scaly overlords of the sky and the small mortal communities living below. The arrangement had real benefits in both directions. Dragons received worship, reverence, and the tribute of mortal attention, which they valued in the way that any being capable of dominating others values acknowledgement. Humans received protection from other threats, guidance, and access to the magical knowledge that dragons possessed in abundance. The dragon priests in this early period were respected figures, not feared, or not primarily feared. Their masks, those ornate pieces of enchanted craftsmanship that we find on the skeletal remains of dragon priests in Skyrim's ancient tombs, were gifts from their draconic patrons, each one imbued with powers that reflected the specific personality and domain of the dragon that particular priest served. 8 high-ranking priests, each bound to a specific dragon. The enchantments varied because the relationships varied. Dragon priest lore is not standardized, repeated pattern equipment. It is a record of individual connections between mortal servants and their inhuman lords. At their capital city of Bromjunar, which we know in the game's era as the ruins called Labyrinthian, in the hold of Jalmarch, the highest-ranking dragon priests would gather to conduct what amounted to governance. They settled territorial disputes between the domains of different dragons. They managed the flow of tribute and protection across the province. They adjudicated conflicts between human communities that fell under different draconic territories. The dragon cult was, in its period of greatest sophistication, a complete governmental system, not just a religion, an administrative state with checks and procedures, with a hierarchy that extended from the most powerful dragon priests in Bromjunar all the way down to local cult leaders in individual settlements. Then, something changed. The exact nature of that change is one of the genuine mysteries of Elder Scrolls lore. The historical records are fragmentary and incomplete, filtered through the perspectives of the Nords, who eventually rebelled, and whose accounts naturally emphasize the tyranny rather than the earlier, more complicated relationship. What seems clear is that after the Atmorans arrived in Tamriel, the dragon cult began to shift. The priests who had been intermediaries became something much darker. They began demanding horrific sacrifices. They imposed increasingly brutal laws. They used the power they had accumulated and the implicit threat of their draconic masters to grind human populations into submission, rather than to protect and guide them. Some theories hold that Alduin himself was responsible for this change, that the World Eater, who had always been the most dominant of the dragons, began pushing his subordinates and their priests toward a posture of absolute control rather than mutual benefit, that what Alduin wanted, fundamentally, was not worship but submission, and that the transformation of the dragon cult from a reasonably functional intermediary institution into an instrument of terror was the direct result of his influence reaching down through the hierarchy. Other theories suggest that the change was inherent in the power structure from the beginning, that the dragon cult's apparent benevolence was always conditional on the humans' willingness to keep giving what the dragons wanted, and that as the human population grew and became harder to simply overawe, the dragons and their priests shifted to more direct forms of compulsion. The particular cruelty of the dragon cult's ultimate form is that it had been legitimately beneficial once, which meant the people most deeply invested in it had genuine memories, personal or inherited, of a time when the arrangement worked. The priests who served faithfully in the later period were not simply born into evil. They were the institutional descendants of an organization that had served a real purpose. Their fanaticism, their willingness to enforce increasingly brutal demands, was partly the fanaticism of true believers who had convinced themselves that the original virtue still existed somewhere beneath the present corruption. That human nature, the tendency to protect existing investment by refusing to see how badly the situation has changed, is as recognizable in the dragon cult as it is in any failing institution of the real world. What we know from surviving sources is that by the late Merethic era, the situation in Skyrim had become a genuine tyranny. Human beings were forbidden from speaking words in the dragon language. That was an exclusive privilege of the dragon cult. Think about what that means. The dragon shouts, the Thuum, were the most powerful force available in that world, and the ruling religion had made it illegal for ordinary humans to even utter the sounds that composed it. The language of power was the exclusive property of the powerful, and accessing it without permission was a capital offense. There is a piece of in-game text that captures the specific quality of that era's oppression. The Book of the Dragonborn, findable in various locations across Skyrim, describes how the dragons of the Merethic era regarded the Thuum as their exclusive divine birthright. They genuinely believed that the creative language of reality was theirs, because they were divine and humans were not. To use it without permission was not just rebellion, it was metaphysical trespass. A human speaking the dragon language was, in the ideology of the dragon cult, committing an act of spiritual theft, reaching into the cosmic order, and taking something that belonged to a higher category of being. The particular cruelty of this prohibition is that the Thuum is not exclusively a dragon gift in any physiological sense. The Greybeards demonstrate that humans can learn it through decades of dedicated practice. The voice was never actually exclusive to draconic physiology. The dragon cult's prohibition was a political construct, enforcing a hierarchy that biology did not actually require, which means every human being born into dragon cult rule, who had the natural discipline and aptitude to learn the Thuum, was specifically prevented from developing that capacity by a law with no cosmological justification. The prohibition was a lie maintained by power, rather than a truth maintained by necessity. The last of the dragon cult died, not in battle, but in a monastery, high in the mountains of the Rift, Forelhost. Discovered by the forces of High King Harold in 1E140, the holdouts who had retreated there chose mass suicide over surrender. They drank poison, an act organized and led by the dragon priest Ragat, who died at the center of the ritual and whose remains still occupy the monastery's innermost chamber. The player can find him there in the present day, thousands of years later, still in his place, a skeleton in ancient armor. King Harold's forces found a building full of corpses. The dragon cult ended quietly, in a sealed room at altitude, with everyone who remained choosing the same final act together. Even in its extinction, the cult maintained the organized, hierarchical quality that had defined it in power. They died as they had lived in formation, following the priest's lead to the end. The dragon burial mounds scattered across Skyrim are the direct physical consequence of the Dragon War's aftermath. After the war ended and dragons were hunted down, their corpses were preserved in circular mounds by remaining loyal cultists' holdouts who refused to abandon their faith even after the cult's political power was broken. These were not passive memorials. They were active sites of worship maintained by generations of isolated believers who continued tending dragon graves for thousands of years in the conviction that Alduin would eventually return and resurrect the fallen. The Draugr guarding those mounds are the reanimated remains of those cultists, people who bound themselves in service to the dragon priests, even past death. The most powerful Draugr, the Death Lords who carry ancient Nordic weapons and occasionally use the Thuum themselves, were the highest-ranking cult members in life. They are still responding to the authority structure they believed in, still carrying out the protective function they were bound to, with the same dedication to a purpose that ceased to have any meaning millennia ago. Defeating one is not simply clearing an enemy from a dungeon. It is the end of a commitment made thousands of years ago by someone who believed in it completely. Think about what that means for a moment. The dragon shouts, the Thuum, were the most powerful force available in that world, and the ruling religion had made it illegal for ordinary humans to even utter the sounds that composed it. The language of power was the property of the powerful, and accessing it without permission was a capital offense. Draugr, those ancient corpses that the player fights in virtually every Nordic ruin, are the reanimated remains of dragon cult members who bound themselves in service to the dragon priests, even past death. When you descend into a burial barrow in Skyrim and find those grim, slow-moving figures rising from their stone crypts, you are looking at people who believed so completely in the dragon cult's religion that they submitted to an eternity of undead guardianship rather than simply dying and moving on. Some of them had been lying there for thousands of years before you arrived. Their loyalty to dead priests and dead dragons has been written into their bones, so thoroughly that it survives even the dissolution of the civilization that created them. The dragon priests themselves fared differently, preserved by powerful magic, maintained in states of suspended death that are not quite undead in the Draugr sense. The highest-ranking priests waited in sealed chambers for resurrection or summons that never came. The masks they wore are not just trophies. They are the record of a complete social system that governed all of Skyrim for centuries. Moroke, Otar, Volsung, Ragot, Vokun, Croesus, Nakrian, Kanarik, each name a memory of a specific figure who stood at the apex of a theocratic state that made the entire province its dominion. And still, even in this period of genuine oppression, the picture resists being simple, because not all dragons participated equally in the tyranny. Not all of them embraced the role of living gods, demanding human suffering as tribute. And one of them, one specific dragon who served as Alduin's lieutenant, who had carried out atrocities against humans that were remembered and hated for thousands of years, eventually made a different choice. But that story belongs to the next part of the night. For now, settle a little deeper. The tyranny lasted a long time. Generations of humans were born into it, lived their entire lives under the shadow of draconic rule, and died having never known anything different. The weight of that, the accumulated resignation of people who could imagine no alternatives, is part of what makes the Dragon War, when it finally came, so remarkable. Someone had to be the first to believe that things could change. Someone had to hold the conviction that humans were not, cosmically, destined to exist as subjects of creatures who could reshape reality by speaking. That first crack in the ideology did not come from a human. It came from a dragon who looked at his own kind and decided that the claim to absolute dominance was a lie. The ruins we walk through in Skyrim are quiet now. The traps still activate, the Draugr still stir, the masks still lie on their altar pedestals, waiting. But the civilization that built all of it is gone, and what remains is not a monument to its glory, so much as an archaeological record of what happens when power becomes its own justification. The cold stone of those corridors, the carved Nordic decorations, the word walls with their dragon script, still legible if you know the language. All of it is a memory of a world that lasted for centuries and then ended in fire and rebellion and the long, grinding work of hunting down every last dragon in Skyrim's skies. Sleep carries you now. The ruins are behind you. The fire is warm. Section 3. The Dragon War and the Long Meditation of Paarthurnax. His name means overlord in the dragon language, Paarthurnax. He was Alduin's lieutenant. Of all the dragons who participated in the subjugation of humanity during the dragon cult's rule, Paarthurnax was among the most effective and the most feared. The atrocities attributed to him in ancient Nordic records are not vague or generalized. They are specific. Tens of thousands killed, communities destroyed, an appetite for dominance that matched his elder brothers in intensity, if not in scale. This is the creature who now sits at the very summit of the throat of the world, in perpetual meditation, having maintained a commitment to peaceful existence for more than 3,000 years. The question that the Blades ask, that Delphine asks, is whether 3,000 years of peaceful behavior erases 3,000 years' worth of ancient crimes. It is not a rhetorical question. It does not have an obvious answer. And the game is genuinely honest about that, presenting both sides with a fairness that makes the moral decision feel real rather than manufactured. But let's talk about what actually happened. Because the Dragon War's climax is one of the most extraordinary events in Elder Scrolls lore, and it happened at the exact location where the Greybeards now maintain their monastery. The rebellion began, in the way most genuine revolutions begin, with a shift in what people believed was possible. The humans of Skyrim had been under draconic rule for so long that an alternative probably seemed less like a political option and more like a theological impossibility. The dragons did not merely have power. They were presented and accepted by many as the natural expression of divine order. Rebellion against them was not just dangerous, it was, in the ideology of the dragon cult, sacrilegious. Paarthurnax changed that. The tradition says that Kine, the warrior goddess, wife of Shor, the deity the Nords identify with the wind and with the high places of the world, took pity on the humans suffering under Alduin's rule and persuaded Paarthurnax to defect, to teach the humans what only dragons had ever known, the Thu'um, how to speak in the dragon language, how to turn words into reality, how to fight the thing that had made their subjugation seem permanent. What Paarthurnax gave humanity was not just a weapon. That framing is too narrow, though the weapon part was very real and very important. What he gave them was evidence that the draconic claim to absolute dominance was false. A lie, or at best, a self-serving story that the dragons had told so many times it had become doctrine. If a dragon, Alduin's own second-in-command, could look at the ideology of draconic supremacy and find it wanting, then the ideology was not a cosmic truth. It was a justification. And justifications can be argued against, can be refused. The Nordic warriors who first learned the Thu'um from Paarthurnax became the Tongues. They are named in the records: Gormlaith Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, Feldir the Old, 3 heroes who would eventually face Alduin himself at the summit of the throat of the world. They were not the only Tongues, but they led the final confrontation, and their names are the ones that survived into the songs and the word walls and the saga fragments that the Greybeards still preserve. The Dragon War was long and terrible. Dragons are difficult to kill. Their souls persist even when their bodies are destroyed, and destroying the body, but not the soul, means the dragon can eventually return, given time and power enough to pull itself back together. Only the Dragonborn, someone who is actually born with the innate ability to absorb a dragon's soul and permanently consume it, could truly end a dragon. And in that era, before the Dragonborn had emerged as a recognized phenomenon, the Nords had to find other ways. They used the Thu'um against the dragons in coordinated attacks, using the combined voice of multiple tongues to weaken and overwhelm creatures that individually outmatched any human warrior. Gradually, painfully, the tide turned. Dragons began to be driven from their territories, then hunted down, then killed wherever they could be found. The dragon priests, stripped of their divine protectors, were overthrown. The great temple at Bromjunar fell. The administrative apparatus of the dragon cult collapsed in the same way that any governing structure collapses when its enforcement mechanism is removed quickly and with considerable violence. But Alduin himself was different. He was the firstborn of Akatosh, the most ancient and powerful of all dragons. Even the combined force of the 3 heroes and their Thu'um was not enough to kill him. The battle at the throat of the world, at the exact location we now know as the summit where the Elder Scroll is used in the main questline, ended not with Alduin's death, but with something more desperate and more clever than killing. Feldir the Old used an Elder Scroll to cast Alduin forward through time, not to kill him, to remove him from the present, to defer the problem into the future, to a time when the Dragonborn would exist and the tools would be available to address it permanently. This is the time wound, the temporal anomaly that Paarthurnax describes to the player, the reason why the throat of the world is the most metaphysically significant location in all of Skyrim. Time was fractured there, deliberately, by mortal heroes using one of the most powerful artifacts in existence. The snow at the summit has magical properties because the fabric of time is thinner there. The cold that never relents is not just weather, it is the residual energy of that shattering, still leaking out through the crack in history that the banishment of Alduin created, and Paarthurnax chose to stay there. After his defection, after the Dragon War's end, after the dragon population of Skyrim was systematically hunted to near extinction, Paarthurnax retreated to the one place in the world where the temporal wound was still raw and real. He has been sitting there ever since. Thousands of years, not in comfort, not in peace, Exactly, because peace is not really available to a dragon who carries the weight of what he did before his conversion, but in genuine effort, in meditation, in the daily, hourly, minute-by-minute work of being something different from what he was made to be. The way of the voice was not Parthenax's creation, but he embraced it after Jürgen Windcaller developed it in the centuries following the Dragon War. Jürgen Windcaller was a Nord tongue, a master of the Thu'um who had fought in the battles against the dragons, and who later suffered through the catastrophic defeat of the Nordic tongue warriors at the Battle of Red Mountain. That defeat, which had nothing directly to do with dragons and everything to do with political overreach, was interpreted by Windcaller through years of meditation as a cosmic message. The Thu'um was not meant to be used as a casual weapon. It was not military technology to be deployed whenever a war needed winning. It was a gift from the divine, meant for worship, for contemplation, for the rare moments when reality genuinely required adjustment. Using it constantly, casually, as a first resort rather than a last, dishonored the gift and attracted consequences. Windcaller spent years in meditation developing what became the foundational philosophy of the Greybeards. He spent that time alone, largely, working through the implications of what the defeat at Red Mountain meant about how the Thu'um should be treated. The conclusion he reached was radical for a culture that had used the voice as a primary military technology for generations. He argued that the ability to reshape reality through sound carried with it the obligation to reshape it rarely, carefully, and only when absolutely necessary, and that the violation of this principle was not simply poor strategy, but spiritual transgression. The Greybeards at High Hrothgar are Jürgen Windcaller's legacy. They are the philosophical descendants of his conviction, and their dedication to silence is not cowardice or withdrawal from the world. It is the disciplined expression of the belief that truly understanding a power means knowing when not to use it. The most impressive moment of the Greybeards' power is not any display of force. It is the decades and centuries of silence. The deliberate choice, made each morning, to carry reality-warping capability in their voices and say almost nothing. High Hrothgar itself, the monastery clinging to the side of the throat of the world, at a height most people cannot survive to reach, was built by Parthenax. This detail, available in the game's lore, inverts one of the building's most obvious features. The monastery that trains humans in the way of the voice, that houses the Greybeards in their philosophical isolation, was constructed by the dragon whose defection made the way of the voice possible. Parthenax built the place where his most significant philosophical project would be carried forward, and then retreated above it, beyond the monastery's walls, to continue his own work in the cold above. He visits the Greybeards, presumably. They are, in a very real sense, his students, carrying forward a tradition that traces back to his decision to teach the first tongues. The bond between Parthenax and the Greybeards is protective in both directions. They revere him as the living source of the tradition they maintain. He values them as evidence that what he did in the Dragon War was not simply tactically useful, but genuinely transformative, that the teaching he gave humanity produced a philosophical tradition that has lasted thousands of years and continues to generate wisdom. When Delphine demands his death, the Greybeard's fierce protectiveness of him is not naive loyalty to a teacher. It is the refusal to destroy the living proof that redemption is possible, that a being can choose differently than it was made to choose, and maintain that choice through literal millennia. When they summon the Dragonborn to High Hrothgar by calling out a name, the sound is felt across all of Skyrim. Guards in every hold comment on it. The earth trembles. The air itself carries the sound to places that sound does not normally reach. And that is the Greybeards, using perhaps a fraction of their actual capability, specifically restrained, carefully controlled, used in the most measured way possible, just to send an invitation. Parthenax still sits above them. Older than any living Greybeard, older than any human institution in Skyrim, older than the written history of the province itself, he had not trained another student in over a century when the Dragonborn arrived. The Dragonborn's presence is, by his own description, the most interesting thing that has happened to him in a very long time. And what he does with that interest, the care he takes to explain, to warn, to give the Dragonborn the context they need to understand what they are facing, is itself a form of the practice. Teaching is not separate from the way of the voice. It is part of it. The transmission of understanding from those who have it to those who can use it is itself a kind of speech, a kind of shaping of the world through language, done carefully and with full awareness of what is being passed along. No day goes by, he tells the Dragonborn, where he is not tempted to return to his inborn nature. The impulse to dominate, to conquer, to treat lesser beings as extensions of his will, it does not go away. He has simply gotten very, very good at refusing it. 3,000 years of refusal. That is his actual achievement, and it is greater than any battle victory he ever won. The question of whether he deserves to keep living is ultimately not resolvable by the story. The Blades are not wrong about what he did. He is not wrong about what he has become. The player has to decide, and the game respects the weight of that decision by not making either path feel clean. Let that settle in the warmth. Outside the window of wherever you are, it is dark. The wind may be moving, and at the top of a snowy mountain in a fictional world, an ancient dragon sits in the cold, still refusing, still choosing, still doing the slow and unglamorous work of becoming something better. Section 4. The Dwemer and the Silence After. There are ruins in Skyrim that feel genuinely different from all the others. Nordic barrows are grim and haunted, but they are human in scale, human in intention. The stone walls carry familiar imagery, Nordic knotwork, carved beasts, the iconography of a culture we can recognize. But the Dwemer ruins are something else entirely. Walking into a Dwemer ruin is walking into the aftermath of a civilization that was operating on assumptions about the world that no other culture has ever matched. The metal is still warm. That is the first thing you notice. The machinery is still running, centuries after the people who built it vanished. The automatons, the spiders, the spheres, the towering centurions with their steam breath and their grinding gears are still at their posts, still executing programming that has not been updated in over 3,000 years. Whatever power source the Dwemer engineers devised for their constructs, it has not run dry. Whatever maintenance protocols were built into the systems, they are still functioning. By any reasonable standard of what technology ought to do, in the absence of the people who built it, Dwemer machinery should have ground to a halt within decades. Instead, it has simply continued. This is not magic in the conventional Elder Scrolls sense, or rather, it is not the magic that mages use when they cast spells from the schools of destruction or conjuration or illusion. Dwemer engineering was based on something the scholars of the Fourth Era call tonal architecture, a manipulation of the fundamental resonances of reality itself. The Dwemer understood, at a level of theoretical sophistication that no other civilization has approached, that existence is fundamentally vibrational. That matter and energy, and the laws governing their behavior, are expressions of specific frequencies, specific patterns of resonance, woven into the fabric of the world. And if you know the right frequencies, you can write them into stone and metal. You can build structures that are not simply held together by mechanical stress and physical force, but that are threaded through with resonances that maintain their own integrity. You can power machinery not with fuel that burns up and must be replaced, but with tonal patterns that sustain themselves indefinitely, drawing on the background vibration of reality, the way a tuning fork draws on the acoustic energy of a room. This is also, in a deep sense, what the dragon shouts are, the Thuum, the language that Paarthurnax taught the Nordic heroes. Dragons do not merely make loud noises when they speak. They are writing directly into the code of the world in the same language the world was originally composed in. The Dwemer, through pure engineering and theoretical physics rather than divine gift or innate biological capability, were attempting to achieve the same thing. They were building tonal architecture as a secular, technological parallel to what the dragons did instinctively and what the Greybeards achieved through decades of meditation. That ambition extended in every direction. The Dwemer built underground cities that sprawl for miles beneath the surface of Tamriel, not just in Skyrim, but in Morrowind, in High Rock, through geological formations. We can only partially map. They connected their major settlements through tunnels, deep enough to constitute their own distinct subterranean world. They created automaton guardians of such sophisticated design that the Third Era engineers who tried to reverse engineer them came away with nothing useful. They developed medical understanding, philosophical frameworks, and architectural techniques that still represent the most advanced examples of each in all of recorded Tamrielic history. and they disregarded the gods entirely. Not in the way that an atheist might disregard the divine with skepticism or indifference. The Dwemer approached religion the way they approached everything, empirically. They looked at the claims the Aedra and the Daedra made about themselves, at the evidence for divine intervention in the world, at the texts and traditions that other cultures built their spiritual lives around, and they concluded that divinity was simply another problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be revered. If the divine was real, it was real in the same way that steam pressure and resonant frequency were real, as a phenomenon that could be understood, measured, and eventually reproduced by sufficiently clever engineers. This was not arrogance, or not only arrogance. It was consistency. The Dwemer applied the same empirical framework to everything, and within that framework, the divine was simply the next frontier. Kagrenak, their greatest chief engineer, the figure who would eventually become the engineer of their destruction, articulated this philosophy in a text called Divine Metaphysics. It lays out, with startling clarity, the Dwemer position on godhood, that a god is a being of sufficient tonal complexity and power, that divinity is a technical category rather than a mystical one, and that there is no reason in principle why that category cannot be entered through engineering, rather than through the cosmic coincidences of creation mythology. The heart of Lorkhan, the same heart that the myth says was torn from the dead, God's body and hurled across the world, had come to rest beneath the Red Mountain in Morrowind. The Dwemer found it, and Kagrenak, reading the resonant signature of that artifact, recognized it for what it was, the most concentrated source of tonal power in existence. A piece of genuine divinity, literal and physical, available to be studied and, if the right tools were devised, harnessed. He spent years building those tools, 3 of them, Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard. Each designed for a specific function in the process of accessing the heart's power, of extracting from it the tonal frequencies that would allow the Dwemer to do what no civilization had ever done, deliberately elevate an entire people to a higher order of existence. Kagrenak's plan, as reconstructed from the fragments of evidence that survived the events that followed, was to use the heart to transform the Dwemer race, to weave their collective being into a new order of existence that would make them divine in a real, functional, permanent sense. At the Battle of Red Mountain, in the year 1 E700, Kagrenak struck the heart with his tools, and every Dwemer in all of Tamriel vanished simultaneously, not just in Skyrim, not just in Morrowind, everywhere. Every Dwemer who existed in that single moment was gone. Their machinery kept running. Their food, in a documented case in the city of V. Vardenfell, was found still warm on their tables. Their armor was found in piles next to their beds. The evidence suggests that the vanishing was instantaneous and complete, that there was no warning, no process, no gradual fading. One moment, a civilization of millions was running its empire. The next, the empire was empty, and the machinery was the only thing left to prove it had ever existed. Only one Dwemer survived, Yagrum Bagarn, who was in a dimension outside of Tamriel when the event occurred, exploring what the texts call the Outer Realms, which is probably some form of oblivion or an adjacent plane, returned to find his entire civilization erased from existence. He survived because he was simply not there to be taken. He has been described in Elder Scrolls lore as the last living Dwemer, found by the later era enormously aged and sick with corpus disease, the last witness to a civilization, carrying in his memory the echo of an existence that otherwise left only metal and silence. What actually happened is a question that the game deliberately leaves unresolved because the mystery is part of the point. The most broadly accepted theory is that Kagrenak's use of the tools on the heart of Lorkhan did exactly what he intended. It attempted to weave the Dwemer race into the heart's power, but that the process went wrong, in a specific way. Rather than elevating the Dwemer to divinity, it incorporated them into the heart itself, dissolving their individual identities into the vast tonal energy of a dead god's heartbeat. They did not die, exactly. They were unmade as separate beings and became something else, something that may persist in the rhythms of the heart's resonance. A researcher at the College of Winterhold in the Fourth Era attempted to reproduce this result experimentally. Arniel Gain obtained one of Kagrenak's tools, Keening, and using a soul gem as a substitute for the heart, performed a scaled-down version of the ritual. He vanished the same way the Dwemer had. In an instant, without trace. His shade is said to appear occasionally afterward, in a state that is neither alive nor dead, suggesting that whatever happened to him parallels whatever happened to the Dwemer. His accidental proof is, by itself, one of the most chilling pieces of archaeological evidence in the game. The silence in Dwemer ruins is a specific kind of silence, not the silence of a place that was abandoned or destroyed, but the silence of a place that was simply emptied, all the machinery running, all the lights on, every system nominal, nobody home. If you have ever walked into a building and felt it still operating, the ventilation running, the lights humming but found no one inside, you have a small approximation of what Blackreach must feel like. Multiply that by miles. Multiply it by the knowledge that the people who built it may not have died but may simply exist in a different register of reality, woven into something too large and too strange to communicate with. We will talk about Blackreach next, but for now, the Dwemer's silence is the loudest thing in Skyrim. It rings out from every ruin, from every still-spinning gear, from every automaton still pacing its patrol route with the perfect mechanical reliability of something that was built to outlast its builders by however long it took. It turns out that was forever. Section 5. Blackreach, the kingdom below the kingdom. The name in the Dwemer language is Faljardum Din. Translated roughly, it means blackest kingdom reaches. And that name, when you stand in the space it describes, is not hyperbole. Blackreach is accessible from 3 Dwemer ruins, Alftand, Mzinchaleft, and Raldbar, each of which requires the player to descend through substantial underground architecture before reaching the great vault door that opens into the cavern proper. The first time you come through that door, there is a moment before your eyes adjust, and then the scale of it hits you. It is enormous in a way that does not register immediately as a natural space. The ceiling is hundreds of feet above you, lost in darkness and bioluminescence. Glowing mushrooms the size of oak trees grow in clusters across the cavern floor. Their light, blue-green and cool, filling the darkness with something that is not quite day and not quite night, but has its own complete quality, its own specific atmosphere. Dwemer architecture fills the space between them, roads and buildings and towers, and the great central structure that houses the Tower of Mzark, all of it still immaculately constructed, still carrying that particular Dwemer quality of feeling both ancient and functional at once. The cavern extends beneath all 9 holds of Skyrim. This is not an exaggeration, inserted for dramatic effect. The geological scale of Blackreach is such that its bounds span the entire province above it. It is not a cave, it is an underworld, and it was not built by the Dwemer, though they shaped it into what it became. The cavern itself is a natural formation that predates the Dwemer settlement of Skyrim by millennia. The Dwemer found it and recognized what it could be, an underground highway connecting all their major city-states in the north of Tamriel, a space large enough to house roads, commerce, and entire communities away from the surface world. But something else was there before the Dwemer came. The first inhabitants of Blackreach, according to lore sources confirmed by the Elder Scrolls Online, were vampire clans, ancient bloodlines, some of the first vampires in Tamriel, who descended into the deep places of the world and established their own empires in the dark. The Night Hollow clan, one of the most powerful of these, built their stronghold in a section of Blackreach, below what is now the Reach, and for centuries ruled the surface region above through the terror of their existence, becoming known to the ancestors of the modern Reach folk as the Night Lords. These vampire civilizations predate recorded history, as most scholars understand it. They were already ancient when the Dwemer arrived. The relationship between the Dwemer and the vampire clans of Blackreach was one of the more remarkable diplomatic situations in pre-First Era Tamriel, a largely secular civilization of engineers and philosophers, navigating an active endivation of self, underground territory, already occupied by immortal predators. That relationship ultimately deteriorated. The Dwemer, characteristically, approached the vampire clans as they approached everything, as a subject for study. The Night Hollow clan's unusual dependency on a Daedric artifact, the Dark Heart, an object connected to Namira, the Daedric Prince of Darkness and Decay, made them a particularly interesting subject. The Dwemer eventually stole the Dark Heart and drained most of its power through study, leaving the vampire clans crippled and the Night Hollow almost extinct. It is the kind of action that perfectly encapsulates the Dwemer character. Not malicious, exactly. Just completely indifferent to the cost their empirical curiosity imposed on others. After the Snow Elves were driven underground by Ysgramor's campaign of retribution, a campaign we will cover in detail in a later section, Blackreach became a place of refuge for another dispossessed civilization. The Snow Elves who sought sanctuary with the Dwemer were brought down here, into these vast underground spaces, where the price of their protection was extracted over generations. We will return to them. After the Dwemer vanished in 1E700, Blackreach finally belonged entirely to the Falmer, the descendants of those blinded Snow Elves, who by then had been underground long enough and suffered enough that they had become something very different from what their ancestors were. They spread through the deepest reaches of the cavern, establishing the camps and warrens that you find when you explore the space in the Fourth Era. There is something specific about the loneliness of Blackreach that warrants attention. Unlike the surface ruins of Skyrim, which feel like places that were once inhabited by people and then emptied, Blackreach feels like a place that time forgot to update. The Dwemer roads still run straight and true. The bridges still hold. The aqueducts that once moved water through the underground city still channel liquid through their stone courses. But the creatures moving through that perfect infrastructure are not the engineers who built it. They are the Falmer, blind, feral, communicating in a language of clicks and shrieks, who cannot see or understand or maintain any of what surrounds them. They are the inheritors of a kingdom they cannot perceive. And underground, alone in the cavern, there is a dragon, Volthurial. His name means Dark Overlord Fire in the dragon language. How he came to be in Blackreach, when no other dragon in the entire game is underground, is never explained. He is one of Skyrim's most hidden secrets, accessible only if you know to use unrelenting force on a particular hanging orb in the central structure, which causes the orb to ring with a resonant tone, which Volthurial apparently interprets as a call or a challenge. He emerges from somewhere in the darkness of the cavern's upper reaches, descending toward the sound. The game provides no journal entry, no quest, no explanation. He is simply there. Some fans theorize that he was there before the Dwemer, that the natural cave formation of Blackreach was already his territory when they arrived, and that they either made some accommodation with him or were simply unable to dislodge him. Others think he descended into Blackreach during the Dragon War, seeking refuge in the one place humans would be least likely to find him. Still others suggest the Dwemer brought him here deliberately, that one of their research programs involved the study of dragons and tonal architecture, and that Volthurial was somehow part of that project, trapped or persuaded to remain underground when the Dwemer vanished. The absence of an explanation is, in a strange way, part of what makes Blackreach feel so complete. It is a place that has more history than can be accounted for, more layers of occupation and purpose than any scholarly text has fully catalogued. Vampire empires, Dwemer cities, Snow Elf slavery, Falmer territory, one inexplicable dragon in the dark. These layers sit on top of each other the way geological strata do, each one evidence of a time so different from the present that they barely connect. The crimson nirnroot that grows only in Blackreach, the ingredient that Sindarion spent a lifetime seeking, that his notes show he found in this underground space and died studying, is not native to Tamriel's regular ecology. It grows only here, in the specific conditions of Blackreach's bioluminescent cavern, with no counterpart on any surface biome. It is one more piece of evidence that Blackreach is not simply an underground version of the world above. It is its own ecosystem, its own world, operating on its own logic. The surface and Blackreach are not simply connected by tunnels. They are genuinely different places, and the tunnels between them are passages between worlds. The Dwemer built a system of great lifts to move between the surface and Blackreach, efficiently massive elevator platforms powered by tonal mechanisms, connecting the underground highway to the surface infrastructure. These lifts still function. The attunement sphere, the small Dwemer device required to activate certain mechanisms in the ruins, is still recognized by systems that have been running without input for 3,000 years. The machinery does not know its masters are gone, or if it knows, in whatever rudimentary sense a tonal mechanism can be said to know anything, it does not care. Its function is to run, and so it runs. The soul gem geode veins in Blackreach's rock faces, places where you can mine raw soul gems directly from the geology, suggest that Blackreach is situated at a metaphysical confluence, a place where the boundary between the mortal world and the soul planes is thinner than usual. Soul gems are not simply rocks that happen to be useful for enchanting. They are natural formations that carry the resonance of the soul itself, geological expressions of the fact that the mortal world and the realms beyond it are not entirely separate. Mining them in Blackreach feels different from finding them in a chest or a shopkeeper's inventory. They come from the earth here. They grow here. Breathe. In the cavern below, the bioluminescent mushrooms are glowing their soft blue-green. The automatons are still walking their ancient routes. Somewhere in the darkness of the upper reaches, Voltheriol is roosting. The Falmer are in their camps, unable to see the architectural marvel surrounding them. The silence of the Dwemer is loudest here, in the space they made to hold their empire together. You can feel it in the stillness of air that no one has breathed freely for 3,000 years. Section 6. The Snow Elves, and the Long Betrayal. They were called the Falmer, but before that name was given to the blind, feral creatures that patrol the depths of Skyrim's ruins, before the degeneration and the centuries underground, before the toxic fungi and the darkness, the Snow Elves were something else entirely. They were one of the most sophisticated civilizations in ancient Tamriel. In height and build, they resembled the Altmer, the High Elves, with the same elegant proportions and long lifespans. But where the Altmer favor warm gold and the look of the sun, the Snow Elves carried the look of winter itself. White hair, pale skin, almost luminous in the right light, eyes that ranged from silver to pale gray. They had a strong natural resistance to cold that went beyond the hardiness most races develop in northern climates. They were genuinely immune to the most severe temperatures, comfortable in ice caverns that would kill an unprotected human within hours. Their culture rivaled the Altmer in sophistication. Their architecture, fragments of which survive in the Forgotten Vale, the hidden valley accessed during the Dawnguard questline, shows an aesthetic sensibility that favored graceful curves and organic forms. White stone worked to look almost grown rather than carved. They worshipped Auriel, their name for the divine entity the Imperials call Akatosh, the dragon god of time. The Chantry of Auriel, preserved in the Forgotten Vale, was one of their most sacred sites, a place of pilgrimage and spiritual retreat that survived the destruction of their civilization, because it was hidden deeply enough that no one thought to look there. The Snow Elves and the first human settlers of Skyrim had a relationship that is, like most early relations between different species in Elder Scrolls lore, more complicated than the dominant cultural narratives suggest. The humans who arrived from Atmora were colonizing a land that was already occupied, had been occupied for a very long time by an elven civilization that had its own claims to the territory and its own understanding of what belonged where. The Night of Tears, the event that defines the Atmoran-Snow Elf relationship in almost every account that survives, was not random. It was a targeted attack on the settlement of Sarthal, the first major human city in Skyrim, and the evidence that has emerged from archaeological and textual analysis suggests it was targeted specifically because of something the Atmorans had found beneath it. The Eye of Magnus, a magical artifact of extraordinary power, predating the current era of the world, possibly a remnant of a previous cosmological cycle, had been discovered beneath Sarthal. The Snow Elves, who knew of its existence and its dangers, could not allow a growing human population to remain sitting on top of it. The attack that followed was devastating. Virtually the entire human population of Sarthal was killed. Only Ysgramor and his 2 sons survived. And in the minds of the Atmorans who heard the story Ysgramor brought back to Atmora, it was simply what it appeared to be, a sudden, unprovoked massacre of innocent settlers. What followed was one of the most complete acts of civilizational destruction in recorded history. Ysgramor returned with 500 warriors, the legendary 500 companions, and the war of retribution they waged against the Snow Elves was not a border conflict or a political dispute. It was elimination. Systematic, total, conducted with the explicit intent of ending the Snow Elven presence in Skyrim permanently. The Snow Elves lost battle after battle, losing territory, losing population, losing the infrastructure that had sustained their civilization for millennia. The Battle of the Mosering on Solstheim was the last stand of the Snow Elves as a coherent military force. Their Snow Prince, the last great commander of their armies, fell there, and the defeat broke any remaining organized resistance. Some Snow Elves continued fighting as scattered resistance, some hid in remote locations and tried to survive in isolation, and some, in desperation, in the last extremity of a defeated people searching for any form of sanctuary, went underground. Specifically, they went to the Dwemer. The Snow Elves and the Dwemer had a prior relationship. They had cooperated to some extent against the Atmarans in the early stages of the conflict, an alliance of convenience between two peoples who both had reasons to resist human expansion into Skyrim. But the Snow Elves were now coming not as partners, but as supplicants, defeated, scattered, hunted, asking for protection from the one other major underground civilization that might, in theory, have reason to help them. The Dwemer did not refuse. That is the part of the story that makes it a genuine tragedy rather than simply a horror. They offered sanctuary. They offered protection. The Snow Elves, who descended into the Dwemer cities, were genuinely, technically protected from the Nords who were hunting them. No Nord warrior was going into Dwemer underground cities in pursuit of refugees. But the price was this. To receive Dwemer protection, the Snow Elves would eat a specific fungus that grew in the deep underground. Just a dietary requirement, they were told. Just part of adjusting to the new environment. The fungi were toxic. Specifically, carefully, deliberately toxic in a targeted way that rendered their consumers permanently blind. And it was not just blindness in the individuals who consumed the fungi. The toxin was integrated so deeply into the Snow Elves' diet and physiology over subsequent generations that it became a heritable trait. Their children were born blind. Their children's children were born blind. Every Snow Elf who agreed to Dwemer protection and ate that fungus had purchased safety at the cost of permanently removing sight from their entire lineage, forever. The Dwemer knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a misunderstanding or an accident of Dwemer food culture. It was a calculated act of subjugation. A blind population is a dependent population. A population that cannot see, cannot effectively resist, cannot coordinate complex action, cannot navigate unfamiliar territory without help. The Snow Elves who agreed to the deal became, in a very practical sense, permanent dependents of the civilization that had just blinded them. From dependents, they became slaves. The distinction between the two eroded gradually and then all at once, the way these things tend to do. Generation after generation, living underground, dependent on their Dwemer hosts for food and orientation and everything else that site had once provided, the Snow Elves became utterly integrated into the Dwemer economy as a labor class. They fought in what became known as the War of the Crag, a long, grinding underground conflict as the enslaved Falmer eventually tried to rebel against their Dwemer masters. But by then, the centuries of dependency and the physical changes wrought by blindness and underground living had already begun the transformation that would eventually produce the creatures we encounter in the ruins. When the Dwemer vanished in 1E700, the Snow Elves by then, already deep in their transformation, already bearing the name Falmer, already more defined by their adaptations to underground life than by their connection to their Snow Elf ancestors, were finally free. There was no one left to tell them what to do, to monitor them, to maintain the structures of their enslavement. They had Blackreach and the deep ruins entirely to themselves. But freedom at that point was almost irrelevant. The civilization that had been destroyed was not going to reassemble itself in the absence of its oppressors. The Snow Elves had been blind, underground, and enslaved for so many generations that the accumulated weight of that experience had already done what it had done. The physical changes, the cultural disconnection, the loss of the languages and traditions and spiritual practices that had once made Snow Elf civilization remarkable, all of it was gone. The Falmer did not emerge from the Dwemer ruins in 1E700 and begin rebuilding Snow Elf society. They remained underground, feral in human judgment, though that judgment needs some qualification. What remained of the Snow Elves as a coherent people existed only in two places. In the Forgotten Vale, two Snow Elves who had refused the Dwemer's deal had spent millennia maintaining the Chantry of Auriel in isolation. Knight Paladin Gelibor, whose faith had kept him going through all those uncountable years, is one of the most quietly devastating characters in the game. He believes his brother Werther is still in the sanctum, awaiting purification. He has been waiting, alone, maintaining the way shrines, guiding pilgrims who stopped coming long before recorded history, for so long that he has simply accepted the eternity of his vigil without calculation. His use of the phrase "the betrayed" when referring to the Falmer is not angry, it is grief. Pure, long-settled grief for a people who were tricked into a catastrophe so complete that their descendants can no longer perceive the beauty of the place the snow elves built at the back of the world. The Forgotten Vale is breathtaking. Frozen waterfalls, ice formations of extraordinary delicacy, ancient snow elf architecture in perfect preservation. Standing in it, you are looking at what snow elf civilization looked like before everything went wrong. And outside the Vale's protected boundaries, the Falmer are in the caves, clicking and hissing, unable to see any of it. That contrast is one of the most eloquent things the game ever does without saying a word. Section 7 Ysgramr, the 500, and the bones of what the Companions were. The boat that serves as the headquarters of the Companions in Whiterun is not a replica or a tribute. It is the actual ship, the Jorviskra, one of the vessels that crossed the Sea of Ghosts carrying the 500 companions from Atmora to the shores of Skyrim. It was beached in what would become Whiterun, near the ancient and mysterious Skyforge, and the companions built their mead hall around it rather than moving it. The ship has been there, stationary, for thousands of years. The wood should have rotted. That it hasn't is understood to be a minor magical preservation, the companion's most sacred artifact, held in one piece by the significance attributed to it and the rituals maintained around it. Walking into Jorvaskr and sitting at those long tables, eating and drinking with Ayla and Farkas and Vilkas and Kodlak, you are sitting inside the hull of a ship that once carried the founding population of Nordic civilization in Skyrim. That context is almost never mentioned in-game. The companions of the Fourth Era have moved so far from their origins that most members probably think of Jorvaskr simply as their home, rather than as the physical vessel that links them to the very beginning of human history in this land. Ysgramr himself is one of the most fascinating figures in Elder Scrolls mythology, partly because the story told about him by the Nords is so clearly constructed from a specific perspective, and the game provides just enough context to notice the gaps. He was described as the first human to record history in writing. The Atmarans who came before him relied on oral tradition, on saga and song. Ysgramr developed or imported a written language, a system of runes that became the foundation of the Nordic script. In a culture that would eventually place enormous value on sagas and the recording of heroic deeds, the man who made the writing possible is naturally elevated to mythic status. He is the first. In Nordic mythology, he is as close to a founding figure as the culture has. But the founding act of his career in Skyrim was not settlement or governance or cultural transmission. It was retaliation. It was the assembly of the most powerful military force that Atmora had ever produced, and the systematic application of that force against the Snow Elves until the Snow Elves as a coherent civilization ceased to exist. The 500 companions were not settlers who happened to also be warriors. They were a war party with an explicit eliminationist objective, the conquest of Skyrim, that they carried out the campaign that drove the Snow Elves to extinction as a functional civilization and forced the survivors into the Dwemer tunnels, where they would be betrayed a second time, was conducted with deliberate, organized brutality. Individual members of the 500 are celebrated in Nordic saga for their exploits in battle against the elves, exploits that we would, with modern vocabulary, describe as war crimes. This does not erase Ysgramr's other contributions: the writing system, the founding of the major Nordic settlements, the establishment of the legal and cultural frameworks that would eventually develop into Nordic civilization, the organization of the 500 companions into the founding structure of an institution that survives in some form to the Fourth Era. These are real achievements. But the Companions' origin as an organization, explicitly assembled for the purpose of eliminating a specific people, that origin is not incidental to the organization's history. It is the organization's history, or at least the beginning of it. The companions have evolved significantly over thousands of years, from a genocide force into a mercenary organization that maintains political neutrality and accepts contracts from anyone honorable enough to meet their standards. That evolution required centuries of institutional self-reinvention. The current companions are not what Ysgramor's companions were, but understanding what they were contextualizes the institution in ways that the game invites but does not force on the player. The Harbinger tradition, the title given to the leader of the companions, from Ysgramor onward, is one of the oldest continuous human institutions in Tamriel. Harbinger does not mean leader exactly. It means forerunner, one who heralds what comes after. The title suggests that the leader of the companions is always pointing towards something ahead, rather than simply governing what currently exists. Every Harbinger is, in some sense, holding the possibility of what the companions might become, rather than simply administering what they already are. Kodlak Whitemane, the Harbinger at the time of Skyrim's events, carries this tradition in a specific and deeply personal way. He is the only member of the Inner Circle, the senior companions who have taken the beast blood, who has spent his later years actively trying to undo what was done to him. Lycanthropy is not simply a power in Elder Scrolls lore. It is a spiritual condition. A werewolf, upon death, does not go to Sovngarde. Their soul is claimed by Hircine, the Daedric prince of the hunt, and brought to the hunting grounds, Hircine's personal realm of oblivion, where they hunt for eternity. For a Nord of Kodlak's generation and values, this matters enormously. Sovngarde is not simply a nice afterlife concept. It is the place where the ancestors wait, the place where every Nord warrior hopes to go, and where the warriors of their family line who came before them are already feasting in Shore's Hall. The prospect of dying and going to Hircine's realm, instead of missing the gathering of one's people, of failing to close the circle that should connect a warrior's life to their ancestors' afterlife, is genuinely devastating to someone who holds the Nordic tradition of the warrior's death with any sincerity. Kodlak's quest to cure himself is not simply a gameplay mechanic. It is the story of an old man who has recognized that something he accepted in his youth, something he perhaps accepted without fully understanding its implications, has put his eternal soul at risk. He cannot undo the decades of living with the beast blood, but he can, if the Harbinger he has mentored is capable enough, find a way to cleanse his soul before death takes him. His death in the game, killed by the Silver Hand before the cure can be completed, means that his soul does go to Hircine's realm, that the cleansing must be performed in Ysgramor's tomb, on his shade, rather than on his living body. The quest to send Kodlak to Sovngarde properly is one of the most emotionally coherent arcs in the game. It is not about defeating a villain. It is about honoring a man who deserved a specific kind of ending, and ensuring that he gets it, even after the chance for a living resolution has passed. The Skyforge, near Jorviskr, is ancient beyond reckoning. No one knows who built it or how old it is. The companions settled near it partly because of its extraordinary quality. As a smithing facility, the weapons produced there have a reputation for excellence that goes back as far as Nord oral tradition extends. But its age predates even the snow elf occupation of the land. It predates, as far as anyone can determine, any known civilization in Skyrim. Its origin is one of the genuinely unsolved mysteries. The game is content to leave alone a piece of prehistoric craft, or perhaps something natural that happens to produce ideal smithing conditions, sitting in the middle of Whiterun's Wind District, used daily by Eorland Greymane, its actual nature completely unresolved. There is something appropriate about that. The oldest institution in Nordic culture, the Companions, sitting around the oldest artifact in the city, which is itself the oldest in the region, none of them knowing quite where it came from. The present grows over the past like stone over bone. The living make their meals and conduct their arguments and pursue their feuds on top of foundations they cannot see or fully understand. The Companions do not take political sides. This has been their policy, formalized by a long-ago harbinger named Mrifwile the Withdrawn for centuries. They do not support the Empire or the Stormcloaks. They do not align themselves with any Jarl's political agenda. They are, in practical terms, a free company, a band of warriors who take contracts and honor their commitments and maintain their internal culture, without reference to the political currents flowing around them. This makes them trusted by everyone and owned by no one, which is the specific kind of freedom that the Harbingers have decided is worth maintaining above almost all other considerations. In a province convulsed by civil war, with every institution forced to choose sides, the Companions' neutrality is its own kind of statement. Some see it as cowardice, but the Companions have outlasted every political arrangement in Skyrim's history. They have been there through the succession of jarls and dynasties and conquests and rebellions, maintaining their traditions and their oaths while the political world reorganized itself around them. Their neutrality is not disengagement. It is the specific wisdom of an organization that has watched enough history to know that political arrangements are temporary and that some things matter more than which configuration of power currently calls itself legitimate. The mead hall is warm. The hearth fire is burning. Somewhere upstairs, Kodlak is writing in his journal, trying to find the words for what he hopes and what he fears. Below, in the training yard, someone is sparring in the long Skyrim evening. The oldest boat in the world holds everything above it, Section 8 Sovngarde and what Nords believe about death. The word Sovngarde is derived from Old Norse roots, sevn, meaning sleep or rest, gord, meaning place or yard, the place of rest, the sleeping yard. Even the name carries within it something about what death should feel like, not a sharp ending, but a gradual settling, a relaxation into something larger and more permanent. Norse mythology gave us Valhalla, the great hall where Odin gathered the warriors who died gloriously in battle to feast and drink and fight until the end of time, when they would stand with the gods in the final battle against the forces of destruction. Sovngarde is Tamriel's version of this, filtered through the specific theology and cosmology of the Elder Scrolls universe, and it is one of the most carefully constructed afterlife concepts in video game fiction. The realm exists within Aetherius. This is significant. Aetherius is the immortal plane, the original home of the Et Ada, the divine beings from whom the Aedra descended, the place from which magic flows into the mortal world through the stellar perforations that the gods left behind when they fled creation. Sovngarde is not a separate independent realm like the Plains of Oblivion where the Daedric princes hold court. It is specifically within the divine realm, within the place that the gods came from and that the mortal world was severed from at the moment of creation. For a Nord to go to Sovngarde is, in a real theological sense, to return to the source, to cross back through the boundary that was established when Nirn was made, and to exist in the same dimension as the divine. It is a form of apotheosis, not of power, not of becoming a god, but of location. The worthy dead are simply invited back to the place that everything came from, shore-built Sovngarde. Or rather, the entity the Nords call Shore, whom the Imperials call Lorcan, whom the Redguards call Sep, whom the Dunmer know as the missing god, created the hall and the realm specifically for those who proved themselves in honorable combat. This is a remarkable theological position when you hold it next to Lorcan's other reputation. The entity described by much of Tamriel's religious tradition as a trickster, a deceiver, the being who manipulated the other gods into sacrificing themselves for a creation they hadn't fully consented, to that same entity built the most beloved afterlife in the Nord tradition. The Nord's relationship to Lorcan is fundamentally different from how he is viewed in most other cultures, where the Altmer and many Elvish traditions paint him as essentially villainous, a cosmic con artist whose project damaged the divine. The Nords understand Shore as a hero, a god who fought for humanity, who died for humanity's freedom, whose heart was torn from him and still beats beneath a mountain as evidence of the sacrifice he made. In the Nord pantheon, Shore is not an embarrassment or a villain. He is the patron god of humanity's most fundamental aspiration, the refusal to accept lesser status than what they are capable of claiming. Tsune stands at the bridge, the shield thane of Shore, a great figure from the Dawn era, ancient Nordic myth's description of the time before time, when the gods were still walking the world directly, when the barriers between mortal and divine were thin enough that a human warrior could stand in the hall of a god and measure himself against its guardian. Tsune died honorably in that mythic era, defending Shore against the Aelnofe, the ancient wars that shaped the world before recorded history began. He was given the post of Master of Trials for Sovngarde as a reward for his death, charged with testing the souls who arrive at the Whalebone Bridge to determine whether they have earned entry to the hall. The test is combat. This is, In the Nord understanding of what virtue means exactly right, the way you prove a warrior's worth is not through philosophy or theological argumentation or the recitation of virtuous beliefs. You fight them, and if they can match you, even simply demonstrate genuine courage and genuine skill rather than overwhelming victory, they have shown the quality of their character in the only language that cannot be faked. Physical courage and combat competence in the Nordic tradition are not separate from virtue. They are virtue's most direct expression. The Hall of Valor itself is described by those who have been to Sovngarde or dreamt of it as a mead hall of extraordinary scale, stone walls hung with the imagery of hawks and wolves and the other ancient animal totems of the Nordic tradition, tables set with food that appears and replenishes itself, the air full of the sound of singing and the clashing of cups, and the ongoing contests of strength and skill that the warrior dead apparently engage in continuously and gleefully. There is no suffering in Sovngarde. The physical pain and wear of mortal life, the accumulation of wounds and illness and age, all of it evaporates at the threshold of Shore's Hall. The dead there recognize each other across the generations. The heroes who fought in the Dragon War are there, and they know the heroes who came later, and all of them know the Dragonborn when the Dragonborn arrives. Because even in the afterlife, the Dragonborn's nature is perceptible, in the same way that a Thuum is perceptible, as something that resonates differently from ordinary human presence. Alduin was eating them. This detail, which comes through in the main questline, is one of the game's most genuinely disturbing revelations. When Alduin was cast forward through time and re-emerged in the Fourth Era, he did not simply begin resurrecting dragons and making his presence known on the surface of Skyrim. He found Sovngarde, or found a way to reach into it, and began consuming the souls of the Nordic dead to fuel his resurrection of his draconic army. The mist you move through in Sovngarde's landscape, the unnatural, obscuring, never fully clearing fog, is the expression of his presence. He is literally feeding on the afterlife of an entire people. What this means for the specific souls who are consumed is not entirely clear. Are they gone? Dispersed back into the ethereal background? Is the consuming of a soul in the afterlife a final death or a transformation into something else? The game does not fully answer this, partly because the answers would require a level of metaphysical specificity that would reduce the horror to a technical problem. The horror works best as a horror, as the sense that the most sacred and protected space in Nordic spiritual life has been violated, that the warriors who died honorably and went to their deserved rest are being hunted again in the place where hunting was supposed to be over. The Dragonborn's presence in Sovngarde is the only moment in the game when a living person stands in the realm of the dead and speaks with the ancestors of their entire civilization. The three original heroes, Gormlaith, Hakon, Felder, are there, still carrying the identities they had in the Dragon War, still arguing about strategy and precedent and the correct approach to fighting the World Eater. They helped the Dragonborn in the final battle against Alduin, combining their voices with the Dragonborn's to use Dragonrend, the shout specifically designed to make a dragon experience mortality, to force on it the conceptual experience of being finite and physical and fragile in the way that mortals are, which Alduin, as the World Eater, cannot intuitively comprehend to bring him within range of genuine defeat. The constellation patterns visible in Sovngarde's sky are the same as those marked on the mage, warrior, and thief standing stones scattered across Skyrim. This is a small detail, easily missed, but it confirms what the theology suggests, that the standing stones are not random ancient monuments, but specific terrestrial markers of something that exists in Aetherius. Touch points between the mortal world and the divine realm. The mages and warriors and thieves who activated those stones throughout Skyrim's history were, in some sense, reaching toward the same constellations that illuminate Sovngarde's perpetual sky. There is a version of the Nordlife philosophy that only fully makes sense when you understand what Sovngarde is supposed to be. The emphasis on honorable death, the valorization of dying in battle, the disdain for dying in bed. These are not simply cultural performances of toughness. They are soteriological positions. They are statements about how to live if you believe that the afterlife is not merely a continuation, but a culmination. That the quality of how you die is a direct expression of the quality of how you lived, and that soon at the bridge will simply see through any performance that doesn't reflect genuine character. A Nord who dies of sickness in their bed is not condemned. Sovngarde's doors are not barred to them. But a Nord who dies in the middle of something difficult, who dies refusing to stop fighting, who dies doing what warriors do they carry into Sovngarde, the momentum of a life that never fully stopped, a life that simply continued in a new register. The feasting in Shore's Hall is not a consolation prize for surviving mortality. It is the completion of something that was always heading there. The weight of all that is something that shapes how the Nords of Skyrim, even those who have never consciously articulated their theology, even those who practice their faith as cultural habit rather than genuine belief, carry themselves. They are a people who are, in the back of their minds, always also thinking about how this looks from the other side of the bridge. Whether what they are doing right now is something they would be willing to describe to soon. It is late. The warmth of the hall is around you, that imagined warmth, and the stars outside are the stars of Aetherius. Somewhere up there, past the tears and reality that the fleeing gods left behind, a mead hall holds everyone who ever died honorably in the cold. Their fire is still burning. Section 9. The Daedric Princes and the Edges of Existence. There are 16 of them. 16 Daedric Princes, each the ruler of their own plane of oblivion, each an entity of genuinely incomprehensible power, who chose not to invest themselves in the creation of Nirn, and who has been, as a result, free and unchanged ever since. Their planes of oblivion are not simply territories, they rule. They are expressions of the princes themselves, environments that physically manifest the nature, the obsessions, the philosophical sphere of the being who created them. To enter a Daedric prince's realm is to step inside their mind. Hermaeus Mora rules Apocrypha, a realm that takes the form of an endless library, stacks rising beyond sight, illuminated by a sickly green-yellow light, the floors covered in a dark ocean of toxic fluid from which tentacles emerge without warning. Every text ever written is in Apocrypha. Every text that will ever be written, every secret that has ever been kept, every piece of knowledge that has been deliberately suppressed, every truth that powerful institutions decided was too dangerous to circulate. The books here have black covers with no titles, because the knowledge inside resists easy categorization. To read them, you must be willing to exist in the discomfort of not knowing what you are getting into until you have already gotten into it. Mora himself does not take a humanoid form. He appears as a mass of tentacles and eyes, something oceanic and vast, the visual impression of a being whose attention extends in all directions simultaneously, who has no single perspective, because he has absorbed so many. He is described in the lore as the Tide King, the one who knows, the inevitable knower. He is not interested in evil or good. He is interested in everything, which in practice has the same functional effect as a total absence of moral consideration, because if everything is interesting, then suffering and joy and horror and beauty are equally worthy of collection. His method is seduction rather than coercion. Mora does not force anyone to come to Apocrypha. He does not need to. There will always be scholars and researchers and curious minds for whom the offer of unlimited knowledge, of access to everything that has ever been understood or recorded or discovered, is simply impossible to refuse. He waits. He makes the access available. And those who read the Black Books, the entry points into his realm, scattered through Skyrim and Solstheim, step through a door, they open themselves. Miraak, the first Dragonborn, was one of Mora's greatest acquisitions. A dragon priest who discovered his own nature as a dragonborn during the height of the dragon cult, who turned to Mora for protection when his rebellion against the dragons failed, who has been in Apocrypha for millennia, studying and growing in power, preserved by Mora's interest in what a dragonborn's nature means cosmically. The Dragonborn DLC's central conflict is fundamentally about Mora using one dragonborn to eliminate another, because Miraak has become too independent, too powerful, too likely to escape Apocrypha's reach. Even ancient champions become obsolete when a newer and more interesting specimen comes along. The Ogma Infinium Mora's most famous artifact is a physical manifestation of his philosophy. A book that contains the culmination of Xerxes' knowledge, distilled into a form that a mortal can absorb. Reading it grants sudden mastery of entire branches of skill and knowledge. What the player experiences as a skill boost, the lore frames as something more permanent and more consuming, The knowledge does not simply add to who you are. It overwrites portions of who you were to make room for itself. You emerge from reading the Ogma Infinium, a different person, more capable, but different. Mora trades your present self for an expanded capability, and the trade is not reversible. Nocturnal is the Daedric prince of night and luck. Her realm is the Evergloam, a place of perpetual, comfortable darkness, shadows layered on shadows, a space that feels private rather than hostile, intimate rather than threatening. She is one of the least communicative of the Daedric princes, one of the most inscrutable. Where most princes have clear spheres of interest and pursue them with various degrees of intensity, Nocturnal gives the impression of a being who is simply present in the darkness, watching, recording, unmoved by the events she witnesses. Her relationship with the Thieves Guild is one of the most interesting examples of Daedric patronage in the game. The guild's success is not based on the cleverness of its members or the sophistication of its operations, though those things contribute. It is based on Nocturnal's blessing, a grant of luck so persistent and comprehensive that it shapes the entire organization's fortunes. The skeleton key, her artifact, is not simply a useful tool for lockpicking. It is the physical token of her investment in the guild, the object that keeps her blessing active and channeled through the organization's operations. When Mercer Frey steals the skeleton key and the guild's luck immediately collapses, this is not coincidence. Nocturnal's attention was on the key. Mercer moved the key. Nocturnal's attention moved with it. The relationship is not benevolent in any warm sense. Nocturnal does not love the Thieves Guild, but she finds their work interesting, and she maintains a functional relationship with the most skilled thieves in Skyrim, the way a patron maintains a relationship with artists, not out of affection, but because what they do is worth watching. The guild's members, in return for her blessing, become Nightingale's agents of a specific form of Nocturnal's will, bound to protect access to her realm and the mechanisms that connect it to the mortal world. It is a transactional relationship, but the transaction is real, and the terms are honored by both sides, as long as both sides maintain what they agreed to. Meridia is one of the Daedric princes, most often described as good, and the description is not wrong so much as it is incomplete. Her sphere is life and light, and her hatred of undeath, of necromancy, of vampirism, of the corruption that she sees in anything that uses death as a power source is genuine and consistent. She gifts Dawnbreaker to champions who will carry her crusade against the undead into the mortal world. She communicates more directly and more clearly with her agents than most Daedric princes, and the clarity of her goals makes her relatively trustworthy, in the sense that you know exactly what she wants, and she will give you exactly what she promises in return for delivering it. But she was not originally a Daedric prince. Meridia was one of the Magna Go, one of the beings who fled Nirn when they realized what creation was costing them. Where most of her kind departed and never looked back, Meridia became fascinated with mortals and chose to remain involved in the world's affairs. Other divine beings, in the cosmological framework of the Elder Scrolls, found this decision aberrant. A Magna Ge, who stays involved in the mortal world, is not quite properly divine, but also not properly Daedric. She was eventually categorized alongside the Daedric princes by default, the slot available in the cosmological filing system for powerful entities who do not fit neatly into either the Aedra or the Daedra categories. Her crusade against undeath is therefore not the campaign of someone who simply hates corruption. It is the campaign of someone who gave up their cosmic freedom to remain involved in a world they helped create, who made a genuine investment in the existence of mortal life, and who finds in necromancy and vampirism a fundamental violation of what that investment was supposed to support. When Meridia is ruthless, when her methods seem disproportionate, when she burns things she could have preserved in the course of pursuing her goals, it is the ruthlessness of someone who has been paying attention to the mortal world for a very long time and has concluded that certain compromises simply produce more corruption than they resolve. Hircine is the Prince of the Hunt, ruler of the hunting grounds. His is one of the more straightforward Daedric spheres, the hunt, the beast, the predator-prey relationship, as a fundamental cosmic principle, rather than simply an ecological one. The hunting grounds are not a realm of torture or damnation, exactly. The werewolf souls that go there instead of Sovngarde, including those of the Companion's Circle who die with the beast blood hunt in Hircine's realm for eternity. And the hunting is, in the Nord warriors' terms, not without its pleasures. But it is not Sovngarde. It is not the Hall of Valor and the gathering of the ancestors, and soon at the bridge. The lycanthropy that the companions carry the beast blood introduced by the harbinger Terfeig in an act whose full reasoning is not recorded is Hircine's entry into the companions' tradition. The pact made with the witches of Glenmoral Coven, which infected the Circle's members with werewolf transformations, gave the companions access to a form of combat power unprecedented in mortal terms. Werewolf warriors fighting in their beast form are not human-level threats to anything. But the spiritual cost was real and permanent until the cure was found, and Kodlak's dream of harbingers stretching back through history, watching them ascend to Sovngarde, and then watching the line interrupted by Terfeig's transformation into the hunting grounds, is one of the most quietly heartbreaking images in the game. Molag Bal, the prince of domination and enslavement, created vampirism. His sphere is the subjugation of the will, not simply power over others, but the specific pleasure of reducing autonomous beings to instruments of someone else's purpose. Vampirism in the Elder Scrolls lore is not a simple disease, or even primarily a curse in the colloquial sense. It is the physical manifestation of Molag Bal's philosophy made transmissible. Each vampire is a vessel for the principle of domination, carrying Molag Bal's foundational act of violation in their blood and passing it on through the same mechanism, blood, intimacy, predation that defines the vampire's relationship to the world. The great distinction that runs through all of these princes, and that makes them so fascinating as figures, is that not one of them is evil in any simple or comfortable sense. Each is the expression of a specific, coherent philosophical principle taken to its absolute logical extreme, and maintained there without the compromises that mortal limitation normally requires. Mora is not evil for wanting all knowledge. The desire for knowledge is not evil, but the complete absence of any valuing of what that knowledge costs, the people it is taken from that absence, is what makes him dangerous. Nocturnal is not evil for enjoying darkness and luck and the operations of skilled thieves, but her complete indifference to the harm those thieves do to others on their way to excellence, that is the crack where the danger lives. The Daedric princes are what the original Etada looked like before they were diminished by the act of creation. They are the full power that the Aedra sacrificed in order to make the world. They are, in one reading of the cosmology, what the gods gave up so that Nirn could exist, and they spend eternity in their perfect, pristine planes, watching the diminished world they declined to help build, occasionally reaching into it to collect what interests them. Their artifacts scatter through Skyrim like dropped implements, the ebony blade in Dragon's Reach's hidden room, Mehrunes' razor in Dagon's shrine, the Wabbajack in Pelagius's mind, Dawnbreaker in Meridia's beacon. Each one a piece of a Daedric prince's nature condensed into a physical object and handed to mortals. Each one transformative in ways that go beyond the simple mechanical advantages they provide. To use a Daedric artifact in Elder Scrolls lore is to become, in some small way, an instrument of the prince who made it. To carry a piece of their philosophy in your hand and act it out in the world. The night is deep now. The fire has burned down to coals. In 16 different planes of oblivion, ancient beings who have never changed and never will are doing whatever they do in the eternity they have always inhabited. Some are collecting, some are hunting, some are watching. Some are simply being what they are, which is all a Daedric prince has ever needed to do. Section 10. The Dark Brotherhood, Sithis, and the Architecture of Murder. There is a ritual that a person must perform to contact the Dark Brotherhood. It requires a body, a puppet made from specific materials, dressed to represent the target. The effigy must be stabbed with a blade while the summoner chants an invocation. The materials for the ritual include nightshade, and the extracted bone meal of a human corpse, and a soul gem. These things assembled in the right configuration, performed with genuine intent, with real desire for the death of the person. The effigy produces an effect that travels through the Night Mother and reaches the Brotherhood. This is the Black Sacrament. It is called sacred deliberately. What looks from the outside like a violent piece of folk magic, the kind of superstition a frightened person might stumble into, is, within the Brotherhood's theology, a genuinely sacred act. It is prayer. The materials and the motions and the chanting are not incidental to the magic. They are the form that prayer takes when what you are praying to is not a god of light or harvest or love, but the void itself. Sithis is not a Daedric prince. This is one of the things the Brotherhood's theology insists on most clearly, and it is a theologically coherent insistence. Sithis predates the Daedric princes, predates the Aedra, predates the creation of Nirn, the formation of Aetherius, the existence of the Et'Ada. Sithis is the primordial nothing that existed before any of this, the emptiness against which creation was defined, the absence that makes presence meaningful, the entropy that will eventually return everything to what it was before the beginning. The Daedric princes are powerful, but they are beings. They have identities, personalities, spheres of interest, preferences. They exist in the way that things exist, with boundaries, with definitions, with the limitations that come from being something specific rather than nothing. Sithis has none of these limitations, because Sithis is not a being in any conventional sense. Sithis is the quality of non-being, the cosmic principle of dissolution, the thing toward which all things are moving even when they are most vigorously alive. To worship Sithis is not to worship death in the way that a particular culture might personify and ritualize death. It is to worship change itself, the recognition that everything that exists is temporary, that the forms which matter takes are borrowings against a background of endless dissolution, that the work of entropy is not an evil or a disruption, but the most fundamental operating principle of existence. The Dark Brotherhood understands murder not as a crime against the divine order, but as an acceleration of what the divine order is ultimately producing anyway. Every contract the Brotherhood fulfills is a collaboration with the most permanent force in the universe, the movement of things from existence toward non-existence. The assassin who fulfills a Black Sacrament contract is not defying nature. They are nature's instrument, doing deliberately and swiftly what time would do, eventually and slowly. This is sophisticated theology. It is also obviously available as a rationalization for a professional murder organization, and the Brotherhood's history makes clear that the line between genuine religious conviction and self-serving rationalization has never been cleanly maintained. But the theological framework is coherent, and the game takes it seriously as theology, rather than dismissing it as villain logic. The Night Mother is the only intermediary capable of hearing and transmitting Sithis' will to mortal beings. She is a woman who existed in the Second Era, a Dunmer woman, or a woman believed to be Dunmer, who heard the voice of Sithis in a way that no one else had. She bore 5 children. Sithis told her that to become his bride and the foundation of a new form of worship, she would need to give those children to the void. She killed all 5 of them. The accounts of her subsequent history are multiple and partially contradictory. One tradition says the people of her village, discovering what she had done, killed her and burned her house. Another says she founded the Dark Brotherhood directly from that act, living long enough to establish the organization. What seems consistent across sources is that her physical remains are preserved mummified, maintained by dark magic, carried by Cicero from Cyrodiil to the Brotherhood's Skyrim sanctuary, and that something in or around those remains still communicates. Contracts are transmitted through the Night Mother's corpse. The listener hears the Night Mother's voice. Whether that voice is the original woman's consciousness, a manifestation of Sithis using her corpse as a channel, or something else entirely, is deliberately left unclear. Cicero is the character through whom the game most fully explores what genuine faith in the Brotherhood's theology looks like when stripped of social support and organizational context. By the time the Dragonborn encounters him on the road near Leraeus Farm, he has been the Night Mother's keeper for years. During that time, the Brotherhood in Cyrodiil collapsed around him. Members died or abandoned the cause one by one. Sanctuaries were raided. The organization that had given his life structure and meaning ceased to exist in any functional sense, leaving Cicero alone with a coffin containing a mummified corpse that he was religiously obligated to protect and transport and care for. He talked to her. Obviously. What else would he do? He had no one else. The journals he kept during those years, accessible in the game, dense with his personality and his deteriorating grip on social norms, chart the progress from an eccentric but functional assassin through the stages of a person who has been absolutely alone with their faith for too long. His madness is the specific madness of a person who maintained belief in the absence of community, who kept practices alive after they had lost the social context that normally gives practices their meaning, who continued doing the things that once connected him to other people long after those people were gone. He is the last of the old brotherhood, and he is not fully sane, and he would die for the Night Mother without hesitation, and there is something deeply sad and deeply admirable about both of those things simultaneously. The 5 tenets of the Dark Brotherhood are not optional guidelines. They are absolute religious law, and breaking them is simultaneously a criminal act within the organization and a spiritual sin of a specific category. Thou shalt not steal from Brotherhood members. Thou shalt not kill a Brotherhood member except in self-defense. Thou shalt not betray the Brotherhood. Thou shalt follow the orders of thy superiors. Thou shalt not refuse a contract from the Night Mother. Astrid, who leads the Skyrim sanctuary at the time of the main game's events, has already broken several of these by the time the Dragonborn arrives. She has discarded the tenets as a formal framework. She has made the Brotherhood into essentially a mercenary operation professional, effective, but stripped of the religious dimension that gave the tenets their original force. The Night Mother's coffin has been sitting in the sanctuary, technically present, but the communication has stopped because there is no listener to receive it. When the Night Mother speaks to the Dragonborn, selecting them as the new listener, despite their having no particular connection to the Brotherhood's traditions, it is because she needs someone willing to acknowledge the organization's religious framework, not someone who already believes, simply someone willing to take the framework seriously and act within it. The Dragonborn is the vessel for the Brotherhood's potential recovery. That Astrid's betrayal of the Brotherhood to the Empire, breaking the deepest of the tenets, handing her organization to its enemies triggers the almost complete destruction of the Skyrim sanctuary, demonstrates what the tenets were actually protecting against. Organizations survive not just through competence or secrecy or wealth, but through the internal culture that makes their members genuinely committed to the organization's survival. The tenets were not merely rules. They were the architecture of a commitment structure, the framework that made Brotherhood members willing to die for the organization because the organization meant something beyond its immediate operations. When Astrid stripped that framework out to make the Brotherhood more pragmatic and more businesslike, she removed the thing that made it worth being pragmatic about. The Brotherhood without its theology is simply a group of skilled killers, and skilled killers are available everywhere. Without the theology, without the genuine commitment that the theology could generate, the organization is just a service, and services can be replaced or eliminated without the kind of resistance that comes from genuine believers. The irony of the entire questline is that Astrid, who made herself entirely practical, ended in a situation where the most impractical seeming course of action, honoring the Night Mother's religious authority, maintaining the tenets as sacred rather than as optional, was the one that would have preserved the organization she sacrificed everything else to lead. She burned herself alive at the end, in the sanctuary she had defended and managed. It was the closest thing to a confession available to her. The Night Mother's coffin is still there, in whatever remains of the sanctuary. The mummy still receives prayers through the Black Sacrament. The contracts are still transmitted to those willing to listen for them. Sithis does not mourn the collapse of human institutions. The void does not grieve. It simply waits, as it has always waited, as it always will, patient in the way that only a principle rather than a being can be patient, without desire, without frustration, without anything except the certainty that eventually everything will return to it. The fire is almost entirely out now. The coals are just warm shapes in the dark. Outside, the wind carries whatever it carries, cold or mild, depending on where you are, depending on what season this is for you. Somewhere in a fictional province, the snow is falling on the peaks above High Hrothgar. A dragon who spent 3,000 years choosing not to be what he was made to be is sitting in the cold, still meditating. The automatons in the Dwemer ruins are still walking their routes. The Night Mother's coffin is in its place, the mummified hands folded, the ancient face still. In Sovngarde, the fire in the Hall of Valor burns without fuel, and the ancestors are still celebrating, and soon is still at the bridge, patient as a boulder in a river. All of it is there, waiting to be explored again whenever you want to return. The world of Skyrim is one of those rare constructions that rewards the attention you bring to it. The more you are willing to look beneath the surface, to read the books in the in-game libraries, to talk to the right characters, to hold the lore together and let it connect across time and geography, the more it gives back. The Civil War is not simply a political conflict between two imperfect sides, it is a manipulation. The Companions are not simply a warrior guild, they are a civilization's founding institution, carrying the weight of who they were and who they became. The Dwemer Ruins are not simply obstacle-filled dungeons. They are the aftermath of the most ambitious and most catastrophic intellectual project in Tamrielic history. Even Blackreach, even the underground cavern that most players visit once and leave, is the layered record of vampire empires, Dwemer engineering, snow elf suffering, and Falmer occupation, all stacked on top of each other in an underground world large enough that its surface counterpart looks almost small. It is a lot to hold, and you do not have to hold it all at once. The lore does not expire. The ruins do not go anywhere. The history sits in the walls and the books and the ruins and the automated systems of a vanished civilization, waiting for the next person to look carefully enough to find it. Let your mind drift across it lightly, the way hands drift across the pages of a book you are falling asleep over. The plot does not matter right now. The quest markers are gone. There is just the world, in all its complicated, layered, beautiful, tragic depth. Snow on the mountains, fire in the halls, the dragon language carved into cold stone, the automatons in the dark. If this helped you rest tonight, if Skyrim's deep places gave you somewhere quiet to let your mind go while your body settled, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Drop a comment with what time it is and where you are in the world. Those little notes from the dark always mean something. And if you want more of this, more nights in the old world, more lore from the cold places, subscribing keeps the fire burning. Sleep well. The wind is quiet on the peaks. The stone is old. The stars are old. Everything is fine. Section 11. The College of Winterhold and the Collapse of Magical Order. The College of Winterhold stands on a promontory of rock above the Sea of Ghosts, connected to the town below by a long stone bridge that seems, from certain angles, to float without support above the frozen water far below. The contrast between the college's intact, well-maintained structure and the ruined town behind it is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of environmental storytelling in Skyrim. The college survived the Great Collapse. Winterhold did not. The Great Collapse of 4E122, approximately 80 years before the game's events, was a catastrophic geological event that saw most of the city of Winterhold slide into the sea. The cause has never been definitively established, but the timing corresponds closely with the eruption of the Red Mountain in Morrowind, the cataclysm that devastated that province and sent 2 centuries of Dark Elf refugees westward. The Nords of Winterhold needed no scholarly evidence to identify a cause. The college was there. The college practiced magic. The collapse happened. The conclusion was obvious to them, and has remained obvious to the generations since. The college, naturally, denies responsibility, and the scholarly evidence, such as it is, for an event 80 years past, does not support the theory that magical experimentation caused coastal collapse of that magnitude. But evidence has very little power against grief and loss, and the need to blame something tangible and present. The ruined foundations visible in Winterhold, the empty lots where buildings once stood, the few dozen people who remain in the town and who regard the college with a bitterness that 80 years has not softened. All of it is a reminder that institutions carry costs. Their members do not always fully reckon with. The college exists in relative isolation. Its relationship with the surrounding hold is one of barely managed hostility, rather than anything resembling mutual benefit. Students who join must pass through the town to reach the bridge, and the passage is never comfortable. The townspeople are not stupid or malicious. They have simply experienced loss that they attribute, rightly or wrongly, to the organization on the cliff above them, and they live every day within sight of the structure they hold responsible. Inside, the college operates as a functioning academic institution in ways that the game represents with unusual care. Lectures are actually scheduled between 1 and 3 in the afternoon in the teachers' areas of expertise. If something disrupts the college's operations significantly enough, like a dragon attack, the lectures are canceled for 24 hours and then resume. Students follow their own schedules independent of the player's presence. they conduct research. They argue about magical theory in the common areas. They have individual relationships with their teachers that don't simply wait for the player to engage with them. The Arcaneum, the college library, is one of the most extensive collections of knowledge available in Skyrim. Urag Gro-Shub, the orc librarian who has managed it for longer than seems possible for a mortal orc's lifespan, treats it with a ferocity that suggests he knows exactly how irreplaceable it is. His hostility to anyone who mishandles the collection is not the fussiness of a bureaucrat attached to procedure. It is the defensiveness of someone who understands that the volumes on those shelves represent accumulated knowledge that, in many cases, no longer exists anywhere else. Losing even one book is not a matter of replacement cost. Some of these books are the only surviving record of things the world has otherwise forgotten. The Arcaneum holds books from traditions that are no longer practiced, languages that are no longer spoken, magical theories that were abandoned or suppressed, or simply fell out of fashion over centuries of changing magical scholarship. Reading through even a fraction of it gives a sense of how much of the world's knowledge is tenuously preserved, kept alive by the accident of one library still standing, after everything else associated with those ideas is gone. Beneath the college, the Atronic Forge sits in a chamber that most current students have never seen. It predates the college's establishment, connected to an ancient ley of magical power running through the promontory's rock. The forge can materialize Daedric equipment and summon Atronachs permanently bound to service, using specific combinations of ingredients and soul gems. Its existence implies that the location where the college was eventually built was already a site of concentrated magical significance long before the college was founded, that the mages who established the college here were drawn to the location because of what was already there, rather than the reverse. The Orb of Magnus incident that drives the college's main questline reveals the most dangerous thing about the Eye of Magnus specifically. It is not simply powerful. It is unstable in the presence of ordinary magical artifacts and practitioners. When Ancano attempts to use it to access infinite magical power, the Eye's interaction with his attempts causes a magical explosion that nearly consumes the entire college. The Psijic Order, the oldest magical organization in Tamriel, based on an island that occasionally removes itself entirely from normal spacetime, intervenes specifically to remove the Eye from mortal access entirely, sealing it away where it cannot be combined with the ordinary magical infrastructure of the world. The Psijic's casual ability to stop time while walking through the stopped moments, to appear and disappear from any location in Tamriel without warning, to communicate across whatever distance separates them from their subject. All of this performed as matter-of-fact routine, rather than extraordinary effort, contextualizes where the College of Winterhold sits on the actual spectrum of magical power in the world. The college is prestigious, and its masters are accomplished. By the standards of what has existed in Tamriel and what still exists in the Psijics, it is a modest institution doing modest things. The Psijics are the benchmark. The college is considerably below it. The Augur of Dunlane, the entity who speaks to the Dragonborn in the flooded room below the college's main tower, was a student. His name was Dunlane. He was talented and curious, which in a mage is a combination that needs careful management. His curiosity led him past the boundaries that his teachers had set for good reasons, into a magical experiment that produced results no one anticipated. He was transformed into pure magical energy aware, capable of perception and communication, but without physical form, confined to a specific location, unable to leave. The college maintains his chamber. Partly as a resource, the Augur possesses extensive knowledge, accumulated during his transformed existence, and can provide genuine guidance on magical matters that his former teachers could not access. And partly as a warning, every student who passes his chamber door has the option of understanding what is in there and why. Not all of them take the time to find out. The ones who do have a more specific understanding of what too much, too fast looks like as an outcome. The Augur is the lesson that magical ambition and magical wisdom are not the same thing and do not automatically accompany each other. He advises against seeking more power than you can actually use safely. He warns about the Eye of Magnus with more urgency than any other source available to the player. And all of this advice comes from someone who discovered its truth empirically, in a way that he cannot undo, in a form that he will probably occupy until the end of the current era. He is the college's conscience, the voice reminding mages that knowledge is not neutral and power is not simply accumulation. Some experiments are permanent, some transformations cannot be reversed. The magical system of Tamriel, as the college's scholars understand it, divides into several distinct schools, each with its own theoretical foundations, its own history, and its own philosophical implications. Destruction magic is perhaps the most straightforward. The conversion of magical energy into forces of physical harm, fire and frost and lightning channeled through the practitioner's will. Restoration draws on the magical principles that maintain life, channeling energy into healing and protection against the undead. Conjuration crosses the boundary between planes, summoning entities from oblivion, or drawing the bound weapons of Daedric spirits into temporary material form. Alteration reshapes the physical properties of matter and the laws that normally govern it. Illusion works on perception, on the mind's construction of reality, the cognitive filters through which the world is experienced rather than on the world directly. And enchanting, which the college teaches alongside these others, is the art of binding magical effects into physical objects so that they persist without the constant attention of a caster. An enchanted sword is not simply a sword with magic applied to it. It is a sword that has been permanently altered at the level of its relationship to magical principles, a physical object with a magical property bound into its material structure, drawing on soul gems to maintain the effect. The soul gems themselves are a subject that the college's curriculum touches on, but tends not to dwell on, because the implications are uncomfortable. The souls of living creatures are being used as fuel. The soul gem is both a battery and a cage. What it contains is not simply energy, it is a distillation of what someone was. The college's history extends back considerably further than its current modest physical plant suggests. Winterhold, before the Great Collapse, was one of the most significant cities in Skyrim, a trading hub, a political center, a place where the northern shipping routes converged, and where the college's presence gave the city a cultural prestige beyond its economic importance. The mages who taught and studied there had access to a city, to patronage from wealthy merchants and local nobles, to a social infrastructure that supported magical research in ways that the current isolated promontory simply cannot replicate. The Great Collapse did not merely kill buildings, it killed the context that made the college's work possible at a certain scale. What remains is not diminished in its dedication. Tolfdir's patience with beginning students, Feralda's testing of new applicants at the bridge, Mirabelle Irvine's management of the college's practical operations, Enther's quiet secondary commerce in rare and technically illegal goods, all of these form a community that functions despite its circumstances, rather than because of them. They are scholars doing serious work in a provincial institution that most of the world has stopped paying close attention to. That they continue to do it well is its own form of quiet courage. The college's relationship to the Eye of Magnus, once the main questline resolves, leaves an interesting absence. The Eye is gone. The magical crisis it represented is over. But the question of what the Eye was and why it was buried under the ruins of Sarthal, the ancient Nord city, one of the oldest human settlements in Skyrim, that the snow elves burned in the Night of Tears specifically to recover the Eye, has no fully satisfying answer. The Night Mother speaks in the college's context, as the Eye itself, radiating power that disrupts normal, magical function in its presence. It was buried by the ancient Nords, rediscovered by the college's excavation, and nearly used to destroy the world by an Altmer agent of the Dominion. That a Thalmor would want access to an artifact of that power, in a province already destabilized by civil war. At a moment when the Empire is at its most vulnerable, the strategic logic is straightforward. What the Eye actually was, whether it was related to the Eye of Magnus, that the god Magnus used to look back at Nirn from Aetherius, whether its power derived from the sun's connection to the magical laws of the world, these are questions the game offers angles on, without resolving. The Psijics took it because they believed it safer in their keeping than in any mortal institutions. Whatever it was, the world is demonstrably safer without it in anyone's hands, and that is perhaps enough. Section 12. The Thieves' Guild, Shadow Marks, and Nocturnal's Long Game. The Thieves' Guild's influence in Skyrim extends much further than Riften. That is the key thing about the guild that most people, including most of the guild's own members, do not fully appreciate. Riften is where the headquarters is, where the leadership lives, where the operational center of the organization sits in the ragged flagon beneath the ratway. But the guild's actual reach is demonstrated most clearly not through its members' activities, but through the shadow marks carved into buildings and walls across every major city and many smaller settlements throughout the province. Shadow marks are a symbolic language, a system of carved symbols left in locations visible to those who know what to look for and completely invisible to those who do not. A mark can indicate a safe house, a location where a guild member in trouble can seek shelter. It can indicate that a location has already been robbed and is therefore not worth hitting again. It can warn of danger, a guard with unusual vigilance, a homeowner who wakes easily, a dog that cannot be quieted. It can identify escape routes, access points, sympathetic residents willing to look the other way. The information encoded in a shadow mark is operational intelligence, continuously updated by the thieves who work each area and read by the thieves who come after them. This system requires no central coordination once it is established. It runs on the distributed knowledge of everyone who uses it, maintained by the convention that you leave marks for the next person the way you want marks left for you. It is, in its way, a form of mutual aid, a network of criminal solidarity that makes each individual member safer by pooling their knowledge in a format that only the community can read. The shadow mark's presence in cities across Skyrim demonstrates something important about the guild's actual relationship to the political establishment it operates within. The guild does not simply exist despite the presence of guards and laws. It exists with a kind of tacit permission from systems that could eliminate it if they genuinely wanted to. Maven Blackbriar's relationship with the guild in Riften is the most explicit example she controls the guild. The guild controls much of Riften's actual commercial and criminal economy, and she has the leverage over the Jarl Stutinuf, other key figures, that the official apparatus of law enforcement in Riften operates around the guild rather than against it. Maven's elevation to Jarl, if the Imperials win the Civil War, is the game's clearest statement about what power actually looks like behind the official titles. She has been running Riften for years. The previous Jarl was either her puppet or too pragmatic to challenge her dominance. The appointment formalizes what was already true, that the person with the most leverage over the most people, who controls the most critical economic infrastructure, who can call on the most committed professional organization for enforcement, is the person who actually governs the city. The title follows the power, it always has. Nocturnal's blessing over the guild, the supernatural luck that made the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult routine, has shaped the organization's history in ways that individual members cannot perceive. From within. The guild's unusual success over generations, its ability to maintain operations through political upheavals that destroyed comparable organizations, its resistance to infiltration and betrayal beyond what organizational security alone could explain. All of this traces to a baseline of favorable probability that Nocturnal's patronage provides. The consequence of this, which the questline reveals with some force, is that the guild's members are not entirely the autonomous, self-determined operators they believe themselves to be. Their luck is not their own, it is loaned. And when the loan is called in, when Mercer Frey's theft of the skeleton key removes Nocturnal's direct investment, and the luck dries up, everything collapses with a speed that reveals how much of the guild's success was not earned. The Nightingales, the Thieves Guild's inner circle, bound in a specific covenant with Nocturnal, give up something permanent in exchange for her patronage during their mortal lifetimes. After death, Nightingales serve Nocturnal in the Evergloam. Their souls are hers, not in the violating predatory sense that Molag Bal's claim on vampiric souls implies. In a more formal contractual sense, they agreed to serve her in life, and they agreed to serve her in death, and the agreement is honored on both sides. The afterlife of a Nightingale is not Sovngarde. Carlia, Gallus, and the player can all become Nightingales. The player, if they complete the guild's questline, enters into this agreement. The game does not particularly emphasize how permanent this is. It treats the Nightingale Covenant as an honor and a power source, which it is, without dwelling on the implication that accepting it means your soul is not going to the Hall of Valor when you die, regardless of how many dragons you kill or how honorably you live the rest of your life. You can be the Dragonborn who saved all of Tamriel from Alduin, and also someone whose soul is committed to nocturnal service after death because you made a guild covenant you did not fully think through. This is how Daedric deals work. They are specific. They honor the letter, and the implications that were not explicitly stated at the time of agreement are still binding. The skeleton key itself is worth a moment of attention. As a lockpick, it is extraordinary. It cannot break. It opens any lock without degrading. It is the perfect instrument for the guild's primary trade. But its real function is symbolic and theological rather than practical. It is Nocturnal's physical token in the mortal world, the object through which her attention is channeled. The guild's luck is not diffused evenly through all the members, like a subtle ambient blessing. It flows through the key. The key is where the magic actually lives. When Mercer Frey stole it in a betrayal that was itself shaped by how much power the key's proximity had given him, how much Nocturnal's attention had amplified his own considerable natural ability until he grew too confident to maintain loyalty. He took the source, not just a powerful tool. The luck left with it, because the luck was never separate from it. The fact that the key can be kept by the player permanently, if they choose not to return it to Nocturnal's shrine at the end of the questline, is another of those decisions the game presents without underlining. Keeping the skeleton key means maintaining its power as a practical tool. It also means Nocturnal's claim on you, whatever that might imply, for what comes after your mortal life remains unacknowledged and unpaid. You carry a Daedric artifact with a debt attached. In the world of the Elder Scrolls, that kind of thing has a way of mattering eventually, even if no one is visibly keeping score. The Ragged Flagon, the guild's base beneath the Ratway, has the quality that the best criminal headquarters in fiction always have the atmosphere of a place that has been lived in for a very long time by people who needed somewhere to be themselves. The flickering torchlight on the water, the regulars who have been coming here for decades. Vekel, the man behind the bar, who has seen everything and is surprised by almost nothing. Tonelia managing the guild's fencing operation with the professional detachment of someone who has processed thousands of stolen items and stopped thinking of them as objects with histories a long time ago. The atmosphere is not glamorous. It is functional and private and specific in the way that only real places get specific, places that have absorbed the habits of the people who use them until the place itself seems to have a personality. The guild's full name, the Thieves' Guild, is almost never used by its members. They call it the Guild. The specificity is assumed. In Riften, in the Guild's operational territory, there is only one organization that anyone refers to as the Guild, and everyone knows it. The name carries enough weight that it does not need the modifier. That kind of settled institutional presence, not famous exactly, but deeply embedded in the fabric of where it exists, is one of the things the Guild's questline is partly about recovering. Not just fixing the operational problems that Mercer's betrayal caused, restoring the sense that the organization is significant enough to be referred to in the shorthand of something that everyone simply knows about. Section 13. The Civil War, Ulfric, and What Nobody Wins. Let's talk about the Stormcloaks and the Empire, and the specific quality of tragedy that the Civil War carries in Skyrim's lore. Because it is a genuine tragedy, not simply a political disagreement with multiple valid perspectives, though it is also that the White Gold Concordat, signed in 4E 175 at the end of the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, contained multiple humiliating provisions. The Empire ceded substantial territory in Hammerfell, disbanded the Blades, and agreed to ban the worship of Talos within Imperial territory. The Nords of Skyrim felt this last provision as a wound directed specifically at them. Talos Tiber Septim, the man who had conquered all of Tamriel and ascended to divinity, was a Nord. His worship was woven into Nordic identity at a level deeper than theology. The ban was not just a religious imposition. It was a denial of Nordic heritage, a statement from an outside power that the things Nords most believed about themselves were prohibited. Ulfric Stormcloak did not start the rebellion alone or suddenly. He had been building toward it for years, nursing grievance and conviction in roughly equal measure, testing the ideological ground and finding it receptive. His challenge to High King Torrig, the young, inexperienced king who was technically the legitimate authority in Skyrim, was conducted according to ancient Nordic custom. The challenge was legitimate. The tradition it invoked was real. What was contested, And what divided Skyrim along lines that have never fully healed was the method of execution. Ulfric used the Thuum in the duel. He used the voice against someone who had no defense against it, in a context that was supposed to test martial skill and physical courage rather than access to supernatural power. Some Nords see this as evidence of Ulfric's commitment, that he used every tool available to him, that the old ways gave him the right to challenge, and he won by any legitimate means, and that Toryg's inability to defend against the Thuum says something about the difference in their strength. Others see it as dishonorable, that bringing a force Toryg could not counter into a context that was meant to be an equal test stripped the duel of its legitimacy, that Ulfric defeated Toryg the way an adult defeats a child, not by being the better warrior, but by having access to power the other party simply did not have. This ambiguity is never resolved. The game presents both perspectives fairly and lets the player decide what to believe. What the game also provides, if the player pays attention in the Thalmor Embassy, is evidence that the ambiguity ultimately does not matter for the purposes of who the Civil War actually serves. Ulfric's status as an unwitting Thalmor asset is one of the most important pieces of political information in Skyrim, and it is entirely optional. The documents are there. The player can find them or not. Most people, rushing through a stealth mission that has clear objectives, do not stop to read every file. Those who do find, written in the calm, bureaucratic language of institutional intelligence assessment, the Thalmor's evaluation of Ulfric as an asset whose activities are serving their strategic interests precisely as intended, he does not know. He cannot know, because if he knew, the manipulation would stop working. The Thalmor benefit from his success precisely because it is authentic, because his genuine love of Skyrim, his genuine conviction that the Empire has betrayed the Nords, his genuine grief over the Talos ban, all of it produces a rebellion that bleeds both the Empire and Skyrim in exactly the proportions the Thalmor need. If he were a knowing agent, he could be bought off or managed. Because he is a true believer, acting on his own convictions, he is impossible to stop short of killing him, which would end the conflict in ways the Thalmor do not want. The Imperial side is not without its own problems. The Empire's argument that only a united Imperial structure can resist the Thalmor in the eventual Second War is strategically coherent. But the Empire has already surrendered the Talos ban, has already ceded the dignity of the Nordic tradition, has already demonstrated that when forced to choose between honoring Nord culture and maintaining political viability, it will choose the latter. The Stormcloaks who point this out are not wrong. The Imperials who say that imperfect unity is better than principled fragmentation are also not wrong. There is no correct answer to the Civil War, because both sides are fighting for real values in response to real grievances, and both sides are, in the most important possible strategic sense, losing because the conflict itself is the defeat. Every battle fought between Stormcloaks and Imperials is a battle that neither side can fight against the Aldmeri Dominion. Every year the war continues is another year the Thalmor operate freely in Skyrim, hunting Talos worshippers and monitoring the political situation with the calm attentiveness of people who know they are watching the board develop exactly as they need it to. The player can choose. Neither choice is clean. A Stormcloak victory produces an independent Skyrim with no Imperial support and no diplomatic relationships, isolated and exhausted from civil war, facing the most powerful military force in Tamriel essentially alone. An Imperial victory maintains the Talos ban and puts the province back under the governance of an empire that has already demonstrated it will compromise Nordic interests when sufficiently pressured. Both outcomes leave the Thalmor in a stronger position than they were before the war started. The war itself is the Thalmor's victory. Everything else is implementation details. This is grim. The game is honest about it being grim. It does not offer a third option that resolves the dilemma cleanly. It presents a political situation with no good exits and asks the player to choose which set of bad outcomes they prefer. That is, in many ways, the most realistic piece of political writing in a game that generally operates within the conventions of fantasy adventure. Real political situations do not usually have solutions that satisfy everyone. They have trade-offs that require choosing which values you prioritize when you cannot have all of them. Skyrim's Civil War forces that choice and lives with the discomfort of having done so. The province will survive whatever the player chooses. Skyrim has survived worse, but it will carry the cost of the choice, and in the background, patient and methodical, the Aldmeri Dominion will continue its preparations for whatever comes next. The cities themselves carry the Civil War's weight in their populations, in conversations overheard at market stalls and inn tables, in the guards who patrol different allegiances in different holds. Windhelm, Ulfric's capital, has a rawness about it, the Palace of the Kings, the oldest inhabited building in Skyrim, seat of Nordic kings going back before the First Era, maintained by a Jarl who genuinely believes he is restoring something that was taken from his people. The Grey Quarter, where the Dunmer refugees live, in conditions that even Ulfric's own subordinates acknowledge are poor, is the most visible evidence that the liberation Ulfric promises is not uniformly distributed. He fights for Nord freedom with a passion that is genuine and completely visible, and he does not extend the same concern to the Dunmer who share his city. This is not a reason to support the Empire. The imperial holds are not free of their own forms of nativism. The difference is one of visibility. Ulfric's movement, rooted in the specific grievances of one cultural group, makes those grievances explicit in ways that reveal their limits as clearly as their power. He is a patriot in the specific, limited sense that patriotism always has limits. His love is real, and his people are real, and the people outside his people are simply less present in his vision of the future. Elisif the Fair, the widow of the king Ulfric killed, governs solitude, and the imperial aligned holds with the obvious inexperience of someone who never expected to rule. Torrig was young and unprepared. Elisif is younger and more visibly bereft. She is surrounded by advisors who manage the hold's actual governance, while she provides the symbolic authority that keeps the imperial arrangement coherent. She is not a bad person. She is a person placed in a position designed for someone with 20 more years of experience and a great deal more political formation. Whether she would have grown into the role, given time and stability, is one of the questions the Civil War prevents from being answered. A province at war cannot afford the luxury of letting its less experienced leaders develop at a natural pace. The companions watch the Civil War from Whiterun, which maintains its neutrality with the determination of a city that genuinely cannot afford to pick a side. Whiterun sits at the center of Skyrim's road network. Its position makes it commercially essential to everyone. Its neutrality is enforced by geography and economic logic as much as by political preference. Balgruf the Greater is not a pacifist and not a coward. He is a Jarl, doing the arithmetic of what commitment to either side would cost his city in terms of trade, safety, and the practical welfare of the people he governs. That arithmetic currently says neutral. When the war makes neutrality impossible, Whiterun becomes the first and most critical military objective for adults, because everyone already knew that whoever controls Whiterun controls the roads. The Civil War will end, probably. The larger conflict, the long game between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, the question of what Tamriel looks like in 50 years, whether the ban on Talos worship will eventually be lifted, or whether it will be the first provision of many stretches past the game's timeline and into the future that Skyrim's lore has always implied, without depicting. The Elder Scrolls series has always been about a world in motion, change accumulating in the background of whatever immediate adventure occupies the player's attention. The Civil War is one more movement in that long development, significant and painful, and not decisive in any final sense. History does not stop. The world keeps changing. Empires negotiate or collapse. Provinces absorb their losses and continue. What the people of Skyrim are living through feels to them like the most important moment in their world's history, because it always feels that way from inside the moment. Looking back from a century later, a historian would note the Civil War as one phase in a larger realignment, the outcome shaped as much by forces outside anyone's visible awareness as by the decisions of any general or jarl or dragonborn. That is always how history looks from outside it. The tragedy is that no one lives outside it while it is happening. That is the particular weight that every generation carries, and Skyrim's generation carries it in the cold. Now let your mind go quiet again. We have been through a great deal of history tonight, from the creation of the world, through the age of the dragon cult, through the dragon war and the Dwemer's silent ambition and the snow elves' long tragedy, through the founding violence of Nordic civilization and the complicated, layered institution that came from it, through the afterlife that the Nords built in theology, the cosmic forces that the Daedric princes embody, the sacred architecture of murder that the Dark Brotherhood maintains, through the magical politics of the College of Winterhold, and the criminal infrastructure of the Thieves' Guild, and the terrible logic of a civil war that serves no one, it was started by. All of this is the background of a world that most people experience as a series of dungeons and quests and dragons. All of it is there, waiting under the surface, available to anyone willing to look. The snow is still falling on the peaks above High Hrothgar. Paarthurnax is still sitting in the cold, still choosing, still refusing the nature he was made with. The Greybeards are still in their monastery, still silent, still maintaining the practice that thousands of years of Nord culture has produced in its most refined form. The automatons are still walking their routes in Blackreach. The bioluminescent mushrooms are still glowing their cold blue-green light in the underground cavern large enough to hold the province above it. Somewhere in the ruins of Forelhost, Ragat still waits, sealed in the chamber where he led the last act of a civilization. Somewhere in the Forgotten Vale, Gelibor still tends the way shrines, still uses the word betrayed, with the quiet grief of someone who has grieved for a very long time and made peace with the fact that the grieving is probably permanent. Somewhere in Apocrypha's endless library, Hermaeus Mora is reading something that no mortal has ever read and finding it interesting. All of it is there. The whole complicated world of it, built on a cosmological foundation of sacrifice and deception and ancient ambition, populated by beings who are trying in their different ways to make something worthy out of the time and the circumstances they were given. That is what Skyrim is, at its best. Not a setting for a game, though it is that too. A world with enough depth to get genuinely lost in. Enough history to spend a whole night exploring just the surface of, and feel that the surface barely scratches what is underneath. If this helped you rest, if the quiet of old stone and cold peaks and the distant sound of the wind gave your mind somewhere to be while your body settled, then come back. There is always more. The lore does not exhaust. The ruins do not run out. The history keeps going down no matter how far you dig. Subscribe if you want to stay. Comment if you want to leave a mark. And sleep now if you are ready. The fire is out. The snow is falling. The world is very old and very still.